欢迎来到六度解析新闻背后的多维思考，带你洞悉头条背后的世界。在今日华尔街频道的六度解析中，我们将深入探究时事热点，为你揭开新闻背后的真相。在这个信息泛滥、真相难觅的时代，六度解析应运而生。我运用海量数据、人工智能整合以及专家观点，层层剥析每个故事。通过实时背景数据挖掘，确保你获得全面的新闻资讯。然而，我们关注的不仅仅是数据，更重要的是将它们串联起来。我将分析多方视角，揭示隐藏的脉络，为你提供单一媒体常常忽略的背景信息。无论是政治、经济，还是全球事务，我都将为你带来最具洞察力的分析。试想一下，拥有洞悉全局的能力，做出明智的决策，参与有意义的讨论，这就是六度解析带给你的价值。它不仅仅是新闻分析，更是一种赋能的工具。加入今日华尔街的六度解析，共同探索头条背后的故事。你通往深度理解的旅程，从这里开始。不要只是阅读新闻，要解码新闻，理解新闻，活出新闻。这一切尽在六度解析。立即订阅，不错过任何真知灼见，因为了解真相仅仅是个开始。
想成为全球沟通达人吗？六度人工智能语音克隆技术帮你实现梦想。在这个新时代，语言障碍已成过去，我们隆重推出六度人工智能语音克隆系统。这项由欧美亚顶尖专家研发的突破性技术，让你可以克隆自己的声音，并将文字转换成145。
Hello，我们的这个直播应该是恢复了。Hello，大家好，欢迎回到我们华尔街论坛的这一个直播的这一部分啊。那么我们继续谈到刚才的这个直播论坛中的第一个话题呢，就是在7月30日，7月底，那么中共政治局是召开了一个政治局的会议。那么政治局会议中的一个核心就是要以改革为动力，促稳增长，调结构防风险。那么根据这个习近平主持的中共政治局的会议啊，当时就说了，国内经济重点领域风险隐患仍然较多啊，要保持战略定力，要畅想中国经济的光明论。会议同时也说啊，下半年的改革发展稳定任务非常重要，要以改革为动力，促进稳增长、调结构、防风险，及时推出一批条件成熟、可感可及的改革的举措。这里啊，可感可及啊，根据我自己的一个印象呢，应该是一个新词啊，不知道啊，这一次的这个可感可及又能解读出几万字的一个精神指示。就我简单来说吧，这个可感可及可以理解为啊，之前中共啊从高层推出的这些政策呢，那下行到这个最基础这个系统最基层的时候呢，对于普通民众来说是无法感受到、无法感知到，更无法体会到改革带来的种种的变化。而这一次啊，这个中共中央政治局是分析研究了当前的经济形势，在部署了下半年经济工作之后啊，审议了一份叫做《整治形势主义为基层减负的若干规定》。那么这个会议也说啊，当前外部环境的变化带来的不利影响也增多了，国内有效需求不足，经济运行出现分化，重点的领域风险隐患仍然较多，新旧动能存在着阵痛，而这些是发展中、转型中的问题呢，既要增强风险意识和底线思维，又要保持战略的定力，坚定发展信心。这里啊，习近平又是再次畅想了经济光明论。那会议更是强调说啊，那么要以提振消费为重点，扩大中国的这个国内的需求，多渠道增加居民收入，增强中低收入群体的消费能力和意愿，要支持的 方面，包括文旅啊、养老啊、育幼啊、家政等等消费要进一步调动民间投资积极性，扩大有效投资呢。这里啊，这个民营企业家或许又要被拎出来这个歌功颂扬一番了。那会议中是强调的多个点。除了强调的刚才提到的提振消费，那还提到的是要推进高水平的对外开放，优化营商环境啊，促进外贸和外资的发展啊。更重要的是要保障民生，强化就业政策，保障低收入群体，推进社会保障啊，解决食品安全和社会治安问题。尤其这个食品安全和社会治安问题呢，在过去1个多月时间中啊，这个不要说这个罐装。化工油和食用油混装这样的问题呢，社会上我们经常能看见的这个街头的械斗也好啊，街头的流血事件也好啊，可以说啊并不少见啊。这里啊也被归在了保障民生这一个关键的讨论的点中。那对于这样的一份中共中央政治局的会议提到的要以改革为动力啊，促稳增长、调结构、防风险，不知道何明先生有什么觉察出了什么样不一样的内容啊？
中共的再恶劣的、再糟糕的东西，它就是不讲人话啊，它不直接的面对问题啊，告诉大家我们要采取什么措施。所以呢，一个宣传系统已经丧失了公信力的这样一个宣传工具，和现在民众的感受啊，拉开了巨大的这个差距啊。实际上3中全会没有给很多投资者，没有给这一些民众或者经济学家的一些信心呢，就可见中国的宣传系统已经失败到了一定什么程度，一个糟糕到了一定什么程度。另外一个，在执行过程中间，你一方面唱光明，但是另一方面呢，你又做出很多恶劣的事情，比如说中国的税务系统所谓的倒查多少年，这是违背基本上的税务这个运行规则也是呢违背这个基本上的这个应该给投资者企业家信心的一个标志一个这样一个行动呢，就造成今天的很多的认知对中国的经济没有办法准确的这个评估。你如果从经济增长的这个标准来讲，5%也好，4.8%也好，或者4.5%也好，都比以中国今天的经济的总量来讲，这样一个体重来讲，已经是一个非常高的一个目标很少有发达到一定程度之后这样一等经济总量还能够达到这样一个目标。但是事实上呢，中国的某一些产业或者是某一些市场上的这种萎缩也不是崩溃性的相反呢，中国的出口反而有所增加，但是人们没有信心是普遍的。这个没有信心的原因就是呢，中共的这个政府中共的这个党它的整个的跟这个民心的这个需求拉开了一个巨大的这个差距。你说如果从消费的程度来讲，现在的这个饮食，现在的这个旅游现在的这种文化活动是不是到了一种崩溃的情况呢？也没有。我们看到了一些节假日看到了一些状况，人们的消费的热情呢确实出现了爆炸性的这样一种增长但是为什么没有信心？没有信心的一个根本原因就在呢，你这个预期和你现在的这个状况产生了这个脱离。怎么样人们去理解，民众去理解你现在这种经济的一个调整而不是说呢，你要走到所谓的集体经济，你要走到所谓的闭关锁国你要这个实行的对民间经济的打击。你像政治局这种非常空洞发挥的话你怎么去理解？你直接告诉我，对吧？你有哪些政策出来你要做一些哪些东西？所以这是一个对于中国来讲是一个非常要命的问题，而且这种要命的问题会继续下去。你打开那个人民日报，你打开那个中央电视台，全部都是这些屁话全部都是这种假大空的东西。它就不能实际上针对经济政策来放出一些实质性的一些信息，讲出一些实质性的问题，过分的抽象过分的这个政治口号化。 那么不管怎么样啊，如果按照中共的他做事的这种习惯，那么今年5%能不能达到？要么啊你就造假，要么呢你就需要给予一些刺激性的一些措施。按照我的理解呢，啊，如果经济真的是有问题，中共是有足够的工具来释放它的这个政策的这个信息也好，或者是给予啊适当的这个放水也好，这都是可以的。中国的经济没有糟糕到啊这个西方的媒体或者中国的企业家感受到那么糟糕。你当然，你作为一个企业家，你作为一个制造者啊，制造业者，你无论是在广东还是在江浙地区，你感觉到压力是非常的凝重。一方面是同行之间的竞争啊，这个压力很大，出口的市场这样一个啊不确定的因素在增加。然后呢，对于中国的这个政策啊缺乏信心，这几个因素加在一起啊，形成了一种焦虑感，一种焦虑感。你好，你这个中共的官方媒体又只准了唱光明啊，不准来面对真正的这个实际的问题。认知的偏差、信息的偏差是中国的啊一些这个非常明显的这种状况。但是即算是这样，中国的整体的经济的结构问题，包括房地产，造成这个相关企业的萎缩影响，负面因素包括房地产本身啊，那么这些事情是问题，是不是问题？是问题，但是跟2008年美国那种房地产的次贷危机还是不一样的啊，没有那么一种结构性的一种风险，可以通过政策的调整来这个把这个问题啊实现某种程度的软着陆啊。但是中国的系统是一个管理治理能力和现实的情况产生一个脱节的一个问题啊。中共最大的问题就是不讲人话啊，能不能直接由啊这些财政部门、财政部啊、税务局啊，或者是呢这个央行啊，中国有很顶尖的啊这样的一些管理人才啊，出来讲讲人话，不要像三轮秦晖这样搞一些这个人出来讲一大堆空洞的这种东西。其实政治局也是这样，政治局就是针对当前的问题啊，立即的做出相应的这个应对的方法啊。我觉得这才是一个真正的问题。我对中国的经济跟很多的经济学家啊，包括我的一些企业家的朋友的看法是不一样的。啊，中国的经济没有达到一个崩溃啊，一个结构性的一个危机阶段，现在进行的都是一种调整。但是你这些企业进行调整的时候，艰难的时候啊，老百姓的消费啊意愿不高的时候，你要把这个经济激活起来，你适当的放水，适当的这种刺激是必要的啊。所以美国为什么这个在疫情期间啊发那么多钱啊，它是有后患。啊，是有麻烦，或者造成了这个通货膨胀，但是毕竟比当时候的经济死掉啊、僵掉要好很多。消费是可以采取一些措施刺激起来的，而且他也列出了这些东西，对吧？所谓的文旅啊，所谓的老年人呐、所谓的家庭呐、啊，所谓的一些消费开支，这些东西都是可以做的。不做的一个原因就是呢，中共有一点担心呢啊，这个通货膨胀啊，但是现在不是通货膨胀的问题，现在是通货紧缩的问题。
感谢和平先生的补充啊。那么关于这个话题呢，我们就先聊到这里。那么可感可知，究竟能不能可感可知呢？也要看具体的政策落地之后，这个政策的这个接收方给予的反馈呢。接下来来关注一条来自《华尔街日报》的文章。这篇文章说的是啊，被美国锤了5年之后，中国的华为现在是站了起来。5年前啊，美国对华为实施了制裁，那么试图是阻止华为获取美国的技术，防止进行这个更多的科技战。然而呢，华为在中国政府的大力支持下呢，逐步复苏。华为通过拓展新的业务，减少对美国供应商的依赖，并保持在全球通信市场的领先地位。华为是在高端的智能手机市场，在过去1年也强势回归，更在这个全球通讯设备市场维持着一个领先的地位。 也开发出了自己的操作系统以及这个芯片的硬件。尽管这个挑战是一重接一重啊，比如先进的芯片技术的不足啊，华为在中国政府的支持下呢，是通过增加研发投入和市场本土化的策略，继续实现盈利和业务的拓展，而美国则继续关注着华为的动向，并可能会采取更多的措施限制其发展。那在这一篇文章之中那么文章关注到的是，虽然华为在被制裁的最初是步履维艰，但是现在呢，可以用一句话来给出一个结论，就是已经是重新归来。那依靠中国政府提供的巨额资金的支持，华为是拓展了新的业务，提高了盈利能力，并找到了新的方法来减少对美国供应商的依赖。那么现在另外一边在这个中国之外呢，美国是想方设法将华为挤出自己以及盟友的这个网络系统，但是华为仍然保持了在全球通讯设备市场的一个领先地位。此外呢，华为在高端智能手机市场也是借助这个一两个突如其来的动作，是逐步强势回归。而在这样的一个过程中呢，过去标榜着自己独立于中国政府的华为已经是蜕变得越来越像一家这个中国国家领军企业就是从一个亲美的民企变成了一个中国的国企，而帮助中国摆脱对外国供应商的依赖。那么这里有一个计划，有一个行动叫做消 A， 这个 A 就是美国的这个 America 的 A，这个是中国内部的一个可能是在进行的一项行动。这个行动目的就是要消除中国境内的美国技术，而华为的逐步复苏呢，更是说明了美国要遏制中国的科技发展非常的难。那么这个华为的重新崛起似乎是印证了一句古话，就是那些杀不死你的会让你更加强大。而这个华为这个可以被吹嘘变成一篇网文这样的一个过程在背后呢，国家资金是至关重要的。其实根据《华尔街日报》的这篇文章，中国政府自华为成立之初就一直提供着支持，过去几年支持力度更是不断的加大。那在2023年，华为利润增长1倍多，为至少是20年来的最大增幅。这家公司有约2/3的收入是来自中国的国内。那么综合了政府的合同公司注册记录及对前任和现任员工的采访，都显示出中国政府通过优先采购合同和补贴，是向华为提供了数十亿美元的资金，包括国有企业，包括政府机构，包括中共机构采购华为的芯片、智能手机、云服务和软件，甚至是一些采购合同中点名要求使用华为的一个设备。那地方政府也是在这个华为的重新归来中扮演了一个重要角色。有的地方政府是收购了华为的业务，给华为公司注入现金，而华为消费者的这一层的设备，过去是依赖着谷歌的安卓系统那后来呢，华为也是建立了自己的操作系统鸿蒙系统甚至说这个鸿蒙系统不仅是包含手机移动领域，更是他们要进军这个办公的桌面系统，甚至华为也进军了电动车的领域采用的是这个合作的一个方式推广自己的一个所谓的智能驾驶座舱。但是这篇文章也说这个华为虽然重新归来听上去很美，但是华为的挑战非常的多。比如华为最先进的半导体仍然落后于英伟达等行业领先者，也有一些业内专家认为如果华为无法获得更先进的西方技术，华为将难以继续创新。那么在美国呢，其实支持限制华为的人士表示其实过去的这些种种限制手段是已经实现了主要目标，那就是减少了美国及其它的美国军事盟友网络中华为设备的数量。那么这个曾任川普政府副国家安全顾问的这个伯明就说我们当时的目标其实并不是让华为破产，我们的目标是保护我们的盟友和数据如果这反而也让华为的日子更难过，那就是一个这个意外锦上添花的一个结果。 那美国这边也在谨慎关注着华为强势归来的一个进展。那么华盛顿也在密切关注华为在制造自主研发半导体方面做出的种种的这个突破啊，可能是如果说华为这边说啊，我们又有新的突破，那可能美国这边的限制手段又会再来了。那么在种种的这些华为的这些故事中啊，其实有一点比较有意思，就是这个华为的老大任正非，他身边的人透露说啊，其实任正非自己是一个怎么说呢，亲美派或者是一个务实派。那对美国对美国的这些高科技企业呢，是有着一种憧憬，有着一种向往甚至是本身任正非可能也是抱着学习的姿态带领着这个华为的手下呢在科研的领域进步。但是5年前呢，美国这当头一棒是让任正非从一个怎么说呢，亲美派变成了一个认清现实派或者是一个务实派。比如华为的这个华为任正非的女儿之一孟晚舟在2021年9月终于从加拿大飞回中国的时候，在接受采访的时候他有一句话这个让人印象深刻，就是孟晚舟就说了我现在才明白我个人的命运呢，其实和国家是十指连扣，息息相关。确实没有这个中国国家力量，就国家层面的这个力量的推动呢，孟晚舟要回到中国呢，确实是非常的难。但是这个也只是另一个平行世界的一个可能，因为毕竟孟晚舟现在是人在中国了。任正非在去年的一次公开演讲中就回忆到华为一位高管就曾告诉过任正非其实美国没有明白，美国当时的这一步限制华为的手段是把一个最亲美的人变成了一个最反美的人。那么这个任正非在自己的这个华为内部讲话中也有过多次鼓励就是说英雄自古多磨难任正非也是把华为在过去几年吃过的苦、栽过的跟头遇到的困难呢，都认为是英雄之路的这个必经的磨难不过这个华为未来的路怎么走呢？如果说抛开中国政府的力挺，抛开中国政府的补贴，华为还能走多远或者是说抛开这样的补贴，国家层面级的一个维护、一个力主支持华为到底是几斤几两？这个可能在未来呢，可能会有更详细的一个新闻进行更综合的阐述。但是华为似乎是在重锤之下重新归来，已经是一个不争的事实了。那么这篇文章最后是以这个华为自己的一些研发的团队认为，华为现在更像是一家国企来结尾或许在未来的日子这个中国政府和华为这一家看起来是民营企业的企业他们之间的关系只会是越来越紧密。这一篇文章和大家分享一下也是综合阐述了华为在过去5年如何从困境中苦苦挣扎，再回到一个领先集团地位的这样的一个故事也请何斌先生分享一下自己的看法。
第一个就是我不知道这个文章是不是真的把任正非先生从一个亲美的人士变成了一个反美的人士我不知道他是不是这么描述的如果是这样描述的话，不管是不是事实这都不是真正关键的东西。第二个是华为是不是这个变成了一个国家企业，或者是国家给不给他支持，其实这对于一个企业来讲也不是关键的东西。真正关键的东西是什么？就是在我追踪这个华为的跟美国产生冲突，被美国赶走然后美国动员他盟友的力量把这个华为赶走，我开始是有一点困惑的，所以我查过很多资料。华为在哪一些方面偷窃了西方的这种知识产权？华为在哪一些方面会伤害到这个西方的国家安全？华为在哪一些方面对美国的或者西方的产业有哪一些这种挑战或者是危害？那么这个站在美国的角度也好，美国的盟友也好，他们做出什么样的决定是基于他们的国家利益，基于他们的意识形态，基于他们的这种安全保护作为中国来讲，你没有什么态度可以抱怨的你 现在是一个指挥美国违背了这个 WTO 的基本的准则，否则的话呢，你如果是只是针对你一个企业它有一系列的指控你能够反抗的力量是非常非常之弱的。哪怕后面你号称有一个中国在后面支撑，哪怕后面你这阵存活下来，这个都不是真正了不起的事情。华为哪怕有一天变得非常的厉害，或者哪一天是这个衰落下去，这只是针对于华为本身的一个结果。真正的问题在哪里？就是刚刚我一直在问这个问题。真正的问题是西方是一个工业文明的一个主导者一个倡导者是一个最重要的一个基础我从英国到德国，然后到美国，再辐射到这些西方民主国家，他们非常重要的力量就是掌握了工业的主导权。但是现在的工业主导权实际上是这个制造业咱们用制造业来形容工业的这个主导权，实际上制造业就是工业。现在的工业的中国的在制造业方面的这样一种能力，站在美国的意识形态、美国的这样一个国家安全或者是它的产业保护来讲，就是一个挑战就是一个威胁，就是一个必须把你打击的这么一个目标华为也好，李威也好，谢伟也好，不重要，也不在乎你亲美还是反美就是要打击你就是要打击你。所以你中国这个华为能承受的这种打击，你厉害，所以你能够活下来如果你承受不了这种打击也是有可能的因为在国际的竞争中间有一些就会被竞争垮掉何况呢这个事情还不完全是竞争，对吧？是有一种打击的这样一个味道。现在布林肯国务卿在菲律宾干什么？在这个日本干什么？要在10几个国家干什么？就是要留下这个拜登总统的一个政治遗产，就是要在亚洲形成对中国的围堵就是要在这个西方形成对这个中国的这种打击这样的一种形态不会因为未来谁当总统或者谁不当总统其实都没关系这是因为你中国改变了一个国际的一个甚至世界的一个规则世界的一个形态，你把工业从原来引以为自豪的西方，你移到了这个中国而且这种制造能力就是一个工业的一个实在能力。哪一个国家如果失去了基本上的制造能力，实际上它就空心化了。这种西方的这种危机感，西方的这种缺乏安全感，西方面临这个挑战，这是一个真实的东西的存在。如果不把这个东西认清楚就单纯的认为这个是伤害一个爱美之心的任正非一个爱美之心那个只是一个表象或者是一个戏剧化的一个场景而已。中国在未来5到10年在这样一个这个竞争中间也好，对抗中间也好，打击中间也好中国确确实实需要重新思考，你是投降对吧？你是这个妥协，还是说呢你自己就是萎缩下去了这是一个真正具有关键性的需要重新思考的问题。只要这一点不改变我觉得中西之间的中国和西方之间的这种关系就没办法得到根本上的改善没办法得到根本上的改善。只会你有一天让西方觉得我已经真的是使尽所有的办法了没办法把你打倒，那可能在那个时候他是认你如果在还没有使尽所有的方法之前，那对中国的这种打击和控制会继续下去。所以中国的企业家也好，中国的政府也好，所谓的外部环境，这就是外部环境。
好，感谢和平先生的补充那这篇文章呢，我们也会在这个其他的频道的子栏目和大家进行一个分享。那接下来第3个话题也是一个突发状况 就是在这个根据网络社交平台 X 上这个账号李老师不是倪老师在今天上午说那么在7月30日，中国的湖南娄底的新化县，有人在天桥上挂起了四通桥标语并用音响大声播放要自由、要民主、要选票罢课、罢工、罢免独裁国贼习近平这个事情呢，也是突然发生的一件事。那这样的一幕这样的横幅上的字，让人想起了近2年前的一个人物，就是彭载舟。在2022年的10月13日上午一名抗议者在中国北京繁华的四通桥挂出了2条长横幅写着不要核酸要吃饭，不要封锁要自由不要谎言要尊严，不要文革要改革，不要领袖要选票，不做奴才做公民。另一条写着呢罢课罢工罢免独裁国贼习近平。这个人呢就是彭载舟，原名彭立发，他呢是黑龙江的一个泰来县人。彭载舟之后就是消失在了公众的视线之中之后的在过去1年多的时间中呢，偶尔会有彭载舟的疑似是介绍彭载舟近况的这个文字信息的传播，但是没有人可以验证这个情况到底是真是假。那时间又来到了2024年的7月底，在湖南娄底新化县，那么这一次又有人在天桥上挂起了和当时四通桥标语一样的一个横幅甚至现场还有这个音响又大声着播放着音频那么这一个又恰逢这个国安是召开了一个学习3中全会公报和决定的这样的一个行动说要宣扬加强所谓的新制国安战斗力那么首先大家对这样的一个新突发的事件纷纷担心的是附近的监控有没有拍到是谁挂了这样的一个横幅。那希望是没拍到，或者是说有人觉得这样挂出横幅的一个表现，是不是有人终于在1年多之后是响应了这个彭载舟当时在北京四通桥上所挂横幅的一个做法当然了，我们也只有1-2段画面1-2段很简短的视频首先连能不能确认这个是在湖南娄底新化县的哪一条街上现在我们暂时还不能做到，但是至少这个横幅应该不是 AI 生成的一个视频，这个是确实有人拍到的一段视频那么这对于这一段视频这样的一则横幅又让人想起了曾经在四通桥上的彭载舟这样的一个突发消息不知道何明先生怎么看？再结合当前现在这个习近平是反复强调要维稳，要维护中国的这个境内的一个安全稳定的状况这样的一个横幅又会造成多少的影响这个得请何明先生来说的。
在当今的这个世界无论你是有权还是有名还是有钱还是你就想简单的做一个视频或者是呢做一个什么事情，都会有人质疑你都会有人反对你。只不过是像习近平这样这些年上台之后遭到这么多人的反对这么多的人的批评这么多人的攻击有很多人在海外我们就看到非常之多了那么在中国大陆实际上对习近平的怨气对习近平的甚至一种仇恨有的人恨不得就是说美国赶紧来一个斩首行动，夸宰也有人呢说习近平是一个中国的走向崩溃跟着呢走向完蛋的一个加速师更多的人认为呢中国现在就在走向倒退就像呢这个走到毛泽东时代，走到文革时代，甚至有人说走到一个人民公社是时代各等各样的看法，各等各样的说法非常之多不要说在中国这样一个压制言论自由的国家有这种声音，就是在美国美国是有充分言论自由的地方。你看两党的这种政治的攻击到了一种好像谁上台美国就会完蛋，对吧？民主党上台会搞成美国完全变成一个 极度政治正确的国家，甚至很多不靠谱的事情呢，好像都放在这个民主党的这个人身上啊。如果哈里斯上台会怎么样？而站在反对川普的人这个面前呢，觉得哇，这个共和党啊，简直是这个十无不赦啊，会大向一个法西斯国家。所以，在美国这样一个相当了不起的一个自由和民主的国家，攻击的这么厉害，那在中国，习近平遭到这么一等攻击，我也觉得不奇怪啊。那么出来几个勇敢的人，哪怕是坐牢，哪怕是销声，哪怕是在肉体上消灭他，他还是要来反对习近平啊。那么来批评习近平啊，这个你在勇气的角度来讲，你确实觉得了不起啊，确实是要这么勇敢。但是只是说彭德州先生在哪里或者是无数的反抗者，他们遭受的那种迫害和打击，你怎么去想象？我是没办法想象。所以我经常跟朋友讲，我是一个矛盾的心态。一方面你觉得反对习近平也好，罢免习近平也好，是一个很正常的一个现代社会一种行为，但是在另外一个角度来讲不能站在海外的角度就鼓吹这些人的行为，因为有些人真的是不了解未来如果遭受到了这样一种苦难的不确定的结果，他有没有这个承受能力，他家人有没有承受能力。所以我们在报道这些事情的时候，特别谨慎和小心，也就是这个道理。有时候我们大量的只是引用这个西方专业媒体的一些报道，而我们自己并不是花很多功夫去把这个事情做大。因为按照我的了解，以今天的不要我的了解吧，大家都很了解，在今天的这样一种社会环境中间，这样一种法治环境中间，不要说这个人是说罢免习近平，他就是在这个正常的司法过程中间，能不能像西方这样得到一个公平的审判、公开的审理，都非常的怀疑在中国能不能实行这一点。何况他是要罢免这个习近平，那这个中国的打击会非常的之强。而现在国际社会能够给予这些人的支持的力度是非常之低的。海外虽然出现社交媒体可能给予这个人的支持、鼓励和帮助，但是呢，你现在西方国家意大利的总理现在不在北京吗？对吧？那么这个其他的欧洲领导人也会相继或者之前去过北京，现在去过北京不是说美国的国务卿刚刚接过王毅吗？但是你要知道，在之前这些西方领导人进中国的时候都口袋里面都会有一份名单，这份名单就是西方认为的政治犯要把它释放，要照顾他们的安全。现在你很少看到西方领导人到中国去访问，口袋里还有这个名单。原因很简单，中国已经呢跟过去不太一样了，他不在乎这个名单，甚至反过来还来反驳你这个名单。这就造成一个呢，你在中国的这样一个勇敢的行为后果是很沉重，而能够得到西方的援助的这个力量是非常之小的你站在个人的角度来讲，我不知道这个人是谁那么你这种行为是勇敢的，我不能说你是不勇敢。但是呢如果你被抓捕了你的后果确实是我很难想象的。中国的这样一场变革会不会还出现像1976年那样大快人心似粉碎习近平，还是说怎么样？我是非常的不看好。我认为中共现在的对中国的控制的程度不是1976年能够比的而且呢，由于过去这些年很多的国家的这种街头运动造成的后果未必是那么良好，所以呢，我也不认为这样一种抗议的活动对中国的现实的改变的力量有多大所以很复杂、很矛盾的一个心理跟大家来分享。
感谢和平先生跟大家分享一个他看到这样一幕的一个比较非常真实的一个想法，确实可让 虽然这个横幅是挂出来了，这个喇叭的声音啊是放出来了，但是大家最关心的是，当时做这个事情的人到底现在在哪里啊？是否还安全？那未来他会不会遭遇一个通缉也好，或者是被暗中缉捕这样的一个遭遇也好，这个可能才是刚才何斌先生所担心的，就是这样的一个在中国的异议人士，那在发表了这样一个非常旗帜鲜明的看法之后会不会遭到一个怎样的遭到怎样苦难的对待？那么在国际社会又在当前的这个所谓援救也好、声援也好能做的不多的情况之下，那这样勇敢的行为是否还有意义啊？这个可能才是我们这个话题中要探讨或者是要抛出来的一个反问或者是一个问题。那么这一次的华尔街论坛呢，这个也是一波三折，但是还好我们这3个话题都是谈完了。要感谢这个一直追着我们、关注着我们、没有关闭屏幕、没有关掉手机的各位的观众，更要感谢各位的打赏，感谢麦团，感谢云水，感谢金山，感谢Donna Friend， 感谢各位的一个打赏，感谢各位的支持。
小杨，前面好像还有好几位打赏你可能要导播给你一下
那是对，在刚开始的几个节目刚开始的这个我们出现了一些状况的这个直播过程中，也有各位的打赏。在我们直播结束之后我会看一下当时的这个打赏名单，那可能在明天才能谢过各位了。那么现在呢今天的直播就到这里，差不多就要结束了那么也感谢各位的支持。那明天的华尔街论坛，我们再和大家不见不散，聊聊这个过去24小时最热门的各类的话题我们这个明天再见。
谢谢，再见。
大家好，欢迎来到我们的6度解析节目。今天我们要探讨的是习近平希望增进中美年轻人交流的计划。习近平承诺在未来5年内邀请5万名美国年轻人来中国参加学习和交流项目，但这一目标并不容易实现。观察家们指出，紧张的地缘政治气候和美国选举的不确定性，以及繁琐的签证申请程序，都是阻碍这一计划的因素。免签入境或许能帮助实现这一目标，但北京和华盛顿的政策和舆论都需要做出调整。这个计划能否成功，还有待观察。请大家继续收看详细内容。各位观众，欢迎收看今天的特别节目。在这期节目中，我们将探讨一篇来自南华早报的文章，内容涉及中国国家主席习近平提出的一个雄心勃勃的计划，在未来5年内邀请5万名美国年轻人访问中国参加学习和交流项目。这一计划旨在改善中美关系，但实现这一目标面临着一系列挑战。在去年11月习近平访问加利福尼亚州时，他宣布了这一计划，并与美国总统乔·拜登会晤。此次会晤中，两国领导人达成共识，希望通过更多的非官方交流来稳定双边关系。自此以来，中国已经举办了多次交流活动，其中之一是上个月在福建省举行的与古岭结缘2024中美青年节，这被宣传为两国建交40多年来最大规模的青年交流活动。有超过200名美国年轻人参加了这一为期1周的活动。习近平在活动中传递了一个信息，认为中美关系的未来在于年轻人，并呼吁两国下一代共同努力，促进双边关系的健康稳定发展。然而，尽管热情满满，实现这一目标并非易事。根据北京智库中国与全球化中心的报告，自习近平宣布计划以来，中国已经举办了至少60场交流活动，但苗绿秘书长指出，还有很长的路要走，数量需要增加。目前，只有几千名美国学生在中国参加长期课程，而有大约30万中国学生在美国大学和学院学习，存在显著的比例失衡。另一个问题是，中美两国更严格的签证政策使得中国组织接待美国代表团变得更加困难。报告呼吁北京允许合格的美国年轻人免签访问中国，正如他已经对约20个国家的公民实行的那样。复旦大学国际问题研究院院长吴新波也在一个安全论坛上表示，鉴于对美国学生的邀请，中国应该在签证问题上更加开放和灵活。他提出的建议是，为什么不为美国年轻人提供免费签证， 鼓励他们来中国寻求真相。这意味着，如果中国能够采取这种单方面行动，可能会非常有帮助。美方也有类似的呼声。新墨西哥州立大学教授肯尼斯·哈蒙德指出，对于美国人来说，获得中国签证是一个非常复杂和非常具有挑战性的过程。哈蒙德认为，对于有意愿前往中国的年轻人，签证程序需要简化，变得更加用户友好。目前，中国已经为10多个国家提供了最多15天的免签入境，大多是欧洲和亚太地区的国家。免签计划被广泛视为吸引更多外资和游客的方法，以促进中国经济的增长，并在多年严格的零新冠控制和打击所谓间谍活动的努力后修复其形象。然而，中美之间的深层不信任仍然是一个巨大的障碍。比如，美国驻华大使尼古拉斯·伯恩斯在 X 平台上发帖称，学术交流对下一代美中领导人了解和理解彼此至关重要。但同时，他在接受《华尔街日报》采访时表示，北京使人际交流变得不可能。北京则驳斥了这些指控，并指责美国虐待中国学生。这反映了两国之间的紧张关系和负面舆论氛围，也使得一些中国组织在与美国开展交流活动或接待美国民间社会交流团体时更加谨慎，甚至避免参与可能引起争议的活动。同样的状况也在美国出现。美中教育合作的老兵丹尼斯·西蒙指出，美国公立大学面临着来自州立法机构控制预算的压力，以及如果看起来对中国过于友好，可能会失去联邦政府研究支持的担忧。他还提到，美国国务院对中国的旅行警告是一个大障碍。在4月的最新更新中，美国将中国的风险评级保持在4级中的3级，建议访客重新考虑前往中国。这些警告引用了当地法律的任意执行和错判拘留的风险。西蒙表示，担心学生去中国会陷入这种情况是荒谬的。他在40多年的工作中从未听说过任何美国学生因为某种政治原因被阻止离开中国的案例。尽管如此，他认为需要有更多的支持来重燃教育联系，同时也呼吁降低旅行警告，因为这将消除人们来中国的一大障碍。美国学生艾姆·甘特即将开始他在弗吉尼亚大学的医学人类学第4年学习。他决定不在中国进行研究，部分原因是他认为在一个实质上没有自由新闻并压制政治意见者的国家待几个月不是一个好主意。这种观点在年轻人中并不少见，反映出中美关系紧张对交流项目的影响。从不同的角度分析，中美关系的复杂性和不确定性显然是阻碍这一计划的重要因素。首先，地缘政治紧张和选举的不确定性让人们对于前往中国心存疑虑。其次，繁琐的签证申请过程也是一个障碍。尽管中国已经为其他国家提供了免签待遇，但对美国尚未实施。进一步简化和开放签证政策可能会促进这个目标的实现。综上所述，习近平提出的5万名美国年轻人来华交流计划虽具有积极意义，但在当前的政治和外交环境下，挑战重重。中美两国需要在多个层面上加强合作和信任，才能真正实现这一目标。对于如何吸引更多美国年轻人前往中国，免签政策和简化签证流程可能是一个有效的突破口。期待未来双方能够在实际行动上取得更多进展，而不仅仅停留在言辞上。感谢大家收看本期节目，接下来我们将继续对这一话题进行深入探索，敬请期待。
请大家继续收看节目第6度百科，对关键内容进行背景介绍。中国国家主席习近平在去年11月访问美国时，宣布了计划，在未来5年内邀请5万名美国年轻人来中国参加学习和交流项目。这一举措旨在改善中美关系，增进两国年轻人之间的理解和交流。然而，这一目标的实现并不容易，地缘政治紧张、美国选举的不确定性和负面的公众舆论都是潜在障碍。目前，美国学生来中国学习面临着繁琐的签证申请过程，这已成为一个显著的阻碍。观察家们建议，北京应该考虑为美国学生提供免签入境，这不仅可以简化流程，还能鼓励更多年轻人来中国。中国已经对约20个国家的公民实行免签政策，如果能将此政策扩展到美国年轻人，将有助于实现习近平的目标。 目前，中国的交流和学习项目大多数是短期的，长期课程的参加者寥寥无几。根据中国与全球化中心的报告，估计目前有近3000名美国学生在中国学习，这个数字远低于10年前的24000名。而在美国，有多达30万中国学生在大学和学院学习，存在显著的比例失衡。免签入境被认为是吸引更多外国投资者和游客的一种手段，这对促进中国经济增长和改善国际形象也有帮助。自去年以来，中国已经为包括新西兰、澳大利亚和波兰在内的10多个国家提供了最多15天的免签入境。然而，除了签证问题，地缘政治紧张也是一个重大挑战。美国政府对中国的旅行警告以及双方之间的深层不信任，使得美国学生和家长对赴华学习感到不安。美国国务院的旅行警告将中国的风险保持在4级中的3级，建议访客重新考虑前往中国，这使得一些美国大学和家庭在选择交流项目时更加谨慎。另一方面，美国国内的反华言论和政治氛围也影响了学生的选择。许多美国学生担心，如果前往中国学习，可能会面临政治风险或被困在当地的可能性。此外，美国政府对公立大学的压力，要求他们减少与中国同行的交流，以及缺乏项目费用的资金，也限制了学生的选择。尽管存在这些挑战，中美两国的一些学术和教育机构仍在努力促进交流。杜克大学和武汉大学的合资企业杜克昆山大学将在8月带领75名美国大学学生代表团前往江苏省。这样的努力被认为是增进两国年轻人之间理解的重要步骤。未来，如何简化签证过程，改善中美之间的政治和社会环境，并提供更多的资金支持，将是实现习近平目标的关键。专家们认为，如果这些问题能够得到解决，将有助于促进中美年轻人之间更密切的交流，从而改善两国关系。
欢迎大家进入6度探索的辩论环节，我们从正反两个角度对本节目进行辩论，请出我们的辩论高手楚天舒、谢琪琪。
我是楚天舒。
我是谢琪琪。
各位观众，大家好。习近平主席的计划无疑是一个伟大的愿景。通过免签入境，更多美国年轻人可以亲身体验中国的文化、历史和发展，这将有助于消除误解，促进中美民间交流，最终达到稳定两国关系的目的。试想一下，当这些美国年轻人回国后，他们会成为中国的友好大使，传播真实的中国故事，这难道不是一个双赢的局面吗？
天哪，楚天舒，你真是太理想化了。不过你说的也太天真了吧？你知不知道现在美国有多少家长担心自己的孩子在中国会面临什么样的风险？这可是个大问题呀。而且美国的选举结果变幻莫测，谁能保证不会出现更多的签证限制呢？还有那些繁琐的签证程序，这可不是说免签就能解决的。你以为免签是魔法棒吗？
哦，谢琪琪，你这话说的好像中国是个龙潭虎穴一样。事实上，中国的治安和生活条件远比你想象的要好得多。根据报告，许多已经来中国的美国学生对这里的经历都给予了高度评价。而且，免签政策确实能够大大简化入境流程，降低出行门槛。你说的那些风险，其实在任何国家都可能存在，重要的是如何管理和预防风险，而不是因噎废食。
楚天舒，你倒是说的头头是道，但事实上呢？别忘了，美国国务院对中国的旅行警告可不是随便发出的。还有，现在中美关系这么紧张，哪个美国父母敢放心让自己的孩子去中国呢？我看这些所谓的交流计划，最后可能只会变成一堆没有实质内容的编排活动，让人们在表面上看起来很和谐，实际上却毫无意义。你说的那些美国年轻大使，恐怕只是你的一厢情愿吧？
谢琪琪，你这种说法实在太悲观了。你难道忘了， 当年尼克松访华时，中美关系也非常紧张，但正是那次访问打开了两国关系的新篇章。这次的交流计划也是一个契机，只要双方都努力，它就有可能达到预期效果。再说了，免签只是第一步，后续还可以通过丰富多样的交流活动，让美国年轻人了解一个真实的中国。你所说的那些担忧，不过是暂时的困难，总有解决的办法。
思想先驱报，成为有洞察力的人。谢谢大家收看六度探索，这是一个由科学家、经济学家、媒体人、工程技术人员合作建立的新型媒体，网友与六度 AI 参与合作完成各种内容，这些内容不能作为任何决策或法律的意见。这是一个新型的试验性媒体方式，我们希望得到大家的支持，修正错误。网友可以参与讨论，也可以向万能的六博士提出你能想出的任何问题。六度世界网址是6do world， 请介绍给你的亲朋好友。大家好，欢迎来到我们的六度解析节目。今天我们要探讨的是美国右翼的2025计划，这对北京来说可能是个坏消息。美国传统基金会制定的这份文件为特朗普领导的政府画出了未来的政治蓝图，并包括了我们如何对抗中国的计划。随着美国大选的升温，专家警告中国应该做好最坏的打算，因为这个计划对中国充满敌意。共和党候选人特朗普否认对详细计划有了解，但这已成为选举的热点话题。文件中的另一个高度优先事项，我们如何对抗中国，显示出敌对的鹰派基调，并将中国视为威胁而非竞争对手。专家指出，如果特朗普再次当选，美国对华政策将更加强硬。请大家继续收看详细内容。各位观众，大家好，欢迎收看我们今天的特别节目。今天我们将带您深入探讨一份引起全球广泛关注的文件，由美国传统基金会发布的2025计划。这份文件不仅为可能由唐纳德·特朗普领导的未来美国政府制定了详细的政治路线图，还明确了我们如何对抗中国的策略。我们将全面复述这篇来自南华早报的文章，并从不同角度进行深入分析和评论。这份2025计划由位于华盛顿的保守派智库美国传统基金会牵头，汇集了超过100个保守派团体的意见。虽然特朗普本人否认对计划的详细内容知情，但它已成为美国总统选举的热门话题。副总统卡马拉·哈里斯在他的民主党竞选集会上将其与特朗普直接联系起来，誓言要击败极端的2025年计划议程。尽管这份计划的主要争议集中在其近900页的国内政策建议上，包括对联邦政府进行大规模重塑的设想，但其中一项高度优先的议题，我们如何对抗中国，引起了北京的特别关注。该计划在多个领域对中国表现出鹰派态度，文件中中国一词出现了483次，涉及国防、贸易和技术等多个方面。智库史听声中心的中国项目主任孙云表示，文件明确表明中国是威胁，而不是竞争对手，并呼吁美国奉行一种明确无误的成本强加战略。他指出，如果特朗普再次当选，美国对华政策将更加严厉，这将是现有政策的进一步迭代。南京大学专门研究中美关系的教授朱峰也表示，无论是2025计划还是最近通过的2024年共和党纲领，都将对中国构成重大挑战。他认为，中国需要做好充分准备，以应对可能的最坏情况。与此呼应，特朗普政府时期的前代理国防部长克里斯托弗·米勒在计划中写道，美国的国防策略应主要关注中国，特别是有效否认台湾的防御。此外，这份计划还提议五角大楼积极对抗中国的一带一路倡议，禁止 TikTok 等中国互联网应用，并制定全面计划，阻止美国实体为中国的人工智能目标做出贡献。前环球时报总编辑胡锡进认为，2025计划对中国的总体基调是令人震惊的恶意。 他质疑这一计划在多大程度上会影响美国实际的对华政策，因为即使特朗普再次当选，也需要优先处理其他问题，并且不能忽视与中国突然断绝经济关系的严重后果。从多个角度来看，文章所展示的2025计划不仅仅是对美国内部政治生态的反应，更是对国际关系，尤其是中美关系的一次重大考验。首先，从美国国内政治角度看，这份文件不仅揭示了特朗普及其支持者可能采取的激进政策，还显示出共和党内部对华策略的深刻分歧。部分共和党人主张完全脱钩，而另一些人则担心这种策略会导致不可预测的风险。其次，从中美关系的角度来看，这份计划无疑会加剧两国间的紧张局势。特朗普政府时期的鹰派政策曾经导致中美关系陷入低谷，而2025计划则可能进一步恶化这种趋势。对于中国来说，这意味着需要在外交、经济和军事领域做好更加严峻的准备。然而，我们也需要看到，尽管这份文件内容严厉，但其实际执行仍然存在许多不确定性。即使特朗普再次当选，他能否完全实现这些计划，仍然是一个未知数。此外，美国内部的政治博弈、国际社会的反应以及中国自身的应对策略，都会对该计划的最终执行产生重大影响。综上所述，2025计划尽管在美国国内和国际社会引发了广泛讨论和担忧，但我们需要密切关注其后续发展，特别是美国总统大选的结果和新一届政府的具体政策实施情况。中美两国作为全球最大的两个经济体，其关系的走向不仅影响两国自身，更将对全球格局产生深远影响。今天的特别节目到这里就告一段落，感谢您的收看，请大家继续关注我们节目对这一话题的深入探索。
请大家继续收看节目第6度百科，对关键内容进行背景介绍。美国右翼是一个广泛且复杂的政治光谱，通常涵盖各种保守派和自由意志主义者群体。在美国政治光谱中，右翼的核心理念包括小政府、个人自由、市场经济、传统家庭价值观和强大的国防。右翼思想在美国的确立可以追溯到建国初期，不过其现代形态多是在20世纪逐渐成型的。保守主义的根源可以回溯到对英国传统的坚持，如约翰·洛克等哲学家的影响。另一方面，自由意志主义则强调个人权利和自由，反对政府对经济和私人生活的干预。1940年代，威廉 ·F. 巴克利等知识分子的崛起，标志着现代美国保守主义的形成。他们强调反对共产主义、小政府和自由市场经济。冷战时期，右翼思潮进一步得到强化，主要是因为对共产主义的恐惧和反对。1970年代和1980年代，里根总统的上台标志着保守主义政策的全盛期，包括减税、减少社会福利和强化国防。近年来，美国右翼有了更加多样化的发展，出现了一些新的思潮和运动，例如茶党运动 （Tea Party Movement） 于2009年兴起，强调财政保守主义和严格的宪法解释。特朗普总统在2016年的当选，也代表了右翼中民粹主义和民族主义的崛起。他的美国优先政策深受部分右翼选民的欢迎。右翼的核心价值观集中在几个关键领域：一、经济政策，右翼通常支持自由市场经济、私有化、低税收和减少政府干预。他们认为经济增长和个人财富的积累是社会繁荣的基础。二、社会政策，在社会事务上，右翼倾向于维护传统家庭价值观，反对堕胎和同性婚姻，支持宗教自由。三、国防和外交政策，右翼主张强大的国防和军事力量，以维护国家安全和国际地位。他们通常持有较为强硬的外交政策，强调国家利益和主权至上。四、个体自由，右翼强调个人自由和权利，反对过度的政府监管和控制。他们特别关注第二修正案所保障的持枪权利。右翼在美国的政治体系中占有重要地位，共和党是主要的右翼政党。共和党内部也存在不同派系，从传统保守派到新保守主义以及自由意志主义者，每个派系在具体政策和理念上有所不同，但总体上都坚持右翼的核心价值观。在选举中，右翼阵营通常得到企业界、宗教团体和农村地区选民的支持。 他们在文化、经济和社会话题上的立场常常与左翼形成鲜明对比，这种对立在近年来的美国政治中表现得尤为明显。尽管右翼在美国政坛上有强大的影响力，但他们也面临许多挑战和争议。例如，关于气候变化、种族问题和移民政策的讨论，常常使右翼在公众舆论中受到批评。不同派系之间的内部争斗也使得右翼阵营有时会显得不那么团结。总的来说，美国右翼代表了一种对小政府、市场经济、传统价值观和强大国防的坚定信念，这种信念深深植根于美国的政治文化和历史中。
欢迎大家进入6度探索的辩论环节，我们从正反两个角度对本节目进行辩论，请出我们的辩论高手楚天舒、谢琪琪。
我是楚天舒。
我是谢琪琪。
大家好，我是楚天舒。首先，美国传统基金会的这个2025计划简直是现代版的孙子兵法。他们已经把中国定性为威胁，而不是竞争对手。这和三国时期的曹操一样，直接把对手当成生死敌人，深谋远虑呀。要知道，在这份计划中，中国被提到足足483次，仿佛不提中国，他们就不知道自己在写什么。
楚天舒，你说的好像美国就是曹操，我们是刘备似的。但别忘了，曹操最后在赤壁也摔了个大跟头。其实，美国的2025计划看起来很吓人，但实际操作起来未必那么容易。就好比你写了个减肥计划，但一遇到炸鸡薯条就全抛脑后了。美国要是断绝和中国的经济关系，那简直就是对自己开刀，毕竟苹果、特斯拉都在中国发大财呢。
谢琪琪，你这是在说美国的减肥计划是一场美式肥胖的滑稽剧吗？就像当年唐玄宗听信杨贵妃的话，结果弄得国库空虚。美国确实有很多企业在中国赚钱，但他们也是因为中国的市场和制造优势。如果美国真要硬着头皮脱钩，那也就是把自己的左膀右臂都砍了，成了一个经济独臂侠。
楚天舒，你这是把美国比作唐玄宗，不怕穿越回去吗？但说真的，美国的鹰派政策就像努尔哈赤的7大恨，他们对中国的怨气简直比当年努尔哈赤对明朝的怨气还大。不过，现在的世界已经不是冷战时期了，全球化的大网已经织得密密麻麻。就像你说的，如果美国真要硬脱钩，那就等着看自己断臂求生的笑话吧。
谢琪琪，你把美国的怨气比作努尔哈赤的7大恨，这比喻也挺有历史感的。不过，我们还得考虑到美国的军事实力。就像秦始皇的长城，美国也在不断加强对华战略防御。特朗普的计划不仅仅是经济脱钩，还包括对中国的军事威胁。要是美国真的对台湾采取军事行动，那可真有可能导致新一轮的世界大战。
楚天舒，秦始皇的长城最后可没挡住蒙古的铁骑呀。美国的军事威胁也许很强，但他们真敢动手吗？历史上每次美国一动手，代价都不小。越南战争、伊拉克战争都是血淋淋的教训。美国人民也不傻，他们不会同意政府为了和中国对抗而再次陷入战争泥潭。特朗普的2025计划就像一出好莱坞大片，特效十足，但现实中能不能拍成还是个大问号。
Title 1, Taking the Reins of Government. America's bicentennial, which culminated on July 4, 1976, was a spirited and unifying celebration of our country, its founding, and its ideals. As we approach our nation's 250th anniversary, which will take place during the next presidency, America is now divided between two opposing forces, woke revolutionaries and those who believe in the ideals of the American Revolution. The former believe that America is, and always has been, systemically racist and that it is not worth celebrating and must be fundamentally transformed, largely through its centralized administrative state. The latter believe in America's history and heroes, its principles and promise, and in everyday Americans and the American way of life. They believe in the Constitution and Republican government. Conservatives, the Americanists in this battle, must fight for the soul of America, which is very much at stake. Just 2 years after the death of the last surviving Constitutional Convention delegate, James Madison, Abraham Lincoln warned that the greatest threat to America would come not from without, but from within. This is evident today, whether it be mask and vaccine mandates, school and business closures, efforts to keep Americans from driving gas cars or using gas stoves, or efforts to defund the police, indoctrinate schoolchildren, alter beloved books, abridge free speech, undermine the colorblind ideal, or deny the biological reality that there are only two sexes. The left's steady stream of insanity appears to be never-ending. The next administration must stand up for American ideals, American families, and American culture, all things in which, thankfully, most Americans still believe. Highlighting this need, former director of the Office of Management and Budget Russ Vought writes in Chapter 2, the modern conservative president's task is to limit, control, and direct the executive branch on behalf of the American people. At the core of this goal is the work of the White House and the central personnel agencies. Article 2 of the Constitution vests all federal executive power in a president, made accountable to the citizenry through regular elections. Our founders wrote, the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America. Accordingly, Vought writes, it is the President's agenda that should matter to the departments and agencies, not their own. Yet the federal bureaucracy has a mind of its own. Federal employees are often ideologically aligned not with the majority of the American people but with one another, posing a profound problem for Republican government, a government of, by, and for the people. As Donald Devine, Dennis Kirk, and Paul Don write in Chapter 3, an autonomous bureaucracy has neither independent constitutional status nor separate moral legitimacy. Byzantine personnel rules provide the bureaucrats with their chief means of self-protection. What's more, knowledge of such rules is used to thwart the president's appointees and agenda. As Devine, Kirk, and Don write, managing the immense bureaucracy of the federal government is impossible without an understanding of the key central personnel agencies and their governing laws and regulations. Many of these laws and regulations governing a largely underworked, overcompensated, and unaccountable federal civilian workforce are so irrational that they would be comical in a less important context. This is true whether it comes to evaluating employees' performance or hiring new employees. Only in the federal government could an applicant in the hiring process be sent to the front of the line because of a history of drug addiction or alcoholism, or due to morbid obesity, irritable bowel syndrome, or a psychiatric disorder. The next administration should insist that the federal government's hiring, evaluation, retention, and compensation practices benefit taxpayers, rather than benefiting the lowest rung of the federal workforce. In order to carry out the president's desires, political appointees must be given the tools, knowledge, and support to overcome the federal government's obstructionist human resources departments. More fundamentally, the new administration must fill its ranks with political appointees. Devine, Kirk, and Don observe that the Trump administration appointed fewer political appointees in its first few months in office than any other recent presidency. This left career employees in charge in many places. This can occur even after departments have been fully staffed with political appointees. Vought writes that the White House Office of Management and Budget, OMB, should establish a reputation as the keeper of commander's intent, yet OMB is dominated by career employees who often try to overrule political appointees serving in the various executive departments. Empowering political appointees across the administration is crucial to a president's success. Above all, the president and those who serve under him or her must be committed to the Constitution and the rule of law. This is particularly true of a conservative administration, which knows that the president is there to uphold the Constitution, not the other way around. If a conservative administration does not respect the Constitution, no administration will. In Chapter 1, former Deputy Chief of Staff to the President Rick Dearborn writes that the White House counsel must take seriously the duty to protect the powers and privileges of the president from encroachments by Congress, the judiciary, and the administrative components of departments and agencies. Equally important, the president must enforce the Constitution and laws as written, rather than proclaiming new law unilaterally. Presidents should not issue mask or vaccine mandates, arbitrarily transfer student loan debt, or issue monarchical mandates of any sort. Legislatures make the laws in a republic, not executives. It is crucial that all three branches of the federal government respect what Matt Eisen called the double security to our liberties, the separation of powers among the three branches, and the separation of powers between the federal government and the states. This double security has been greatly compromised over the years. Vought writes that the modern executive branch writes federal policy, enforces that policy, and often adjudicates whether that policy was properly drafted and enforced. He describes this as constitutionally dire and in urgent need of repair, adding, nothing less than the survival of self-governance in America is at stake. When it comes to ensuring that freedom can flourish, nothing is more important than deconstructing the centralized administrative state. Political appointees who are answerable to the president and have decision-making authority in the executive branch are key to this essential task. The next administration must not cede such authority to nonpartisan experts who pursue their own ends while engaging in groupthink, insulated from American voters. The following chapters detail how the next administration can be responsive to the American people, not to entrenched elites, how it can take care that all the laws are faithfully executed, not merely those that the president desires to see executed, and how it can achieve results and not be stymied by an unelected bureaucracy. Title II, White House Office. From popular culture to academia, the American presidency has long been a prominent fixture of the national imagination, naturally so since it is the beating heart of our nation's power and prestige. It has played, for instance, a feature role in innumerable movies and television shows and has been prodded, analyzed, and critiqued by countless books, essays, and studies. But like nearly everything else in life, there is no substitute for first-hand experience, which this manual has compiled from the experience of presidential appointees and provides an accessible form for future use. With respect to the presidency, it is best to begin with our republic's foundational document. The Constitution gives the executive power to the president. It designates him as commander-in-chief and gives him the responsibility to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. It further prescribes that the president might seek the assistance of the principal officer in each of the executive departments. Beginning with George Washington, every president has been supported by some form of White House office consisting of direct staff officers as well as a cabinet composed of department and agency heads. Since the inaugural administration of the late 18th century, citizens have chosen to devote both their time and their talent to defending and strengthening our nation by serving at the pleasure of the president. Their shared patriotic endeavor has proven to be a noble one, not least because the jobs in what is now known as the White House office, are among the most demanding in all of government. The president must rely on the men and women appointed to the WHO. There simply are not enough hours in the day to manage the affairs of state single-handedly, so delegation is not just advisable, it is essential. The decisions that assistants and senior advisors make will directly impact the administration, its legacy, and most important, the fate of the country. Their agenda must therefore be the president's agenda. Choosing who will carry out that agenda on a daily basis is not only one of the first decisions a president makes in office, but also one of the most critical. The tone and tempo of an administration are often determined on January 20th. Chief of Staff. As with most of the positions that will be covered in this first chapter, the Chief of Staff is also an assistant to the President. However, the Chief is truly first among equals. Of all presidential staff members, the Chief is the most critical to implement a tie-in of the President's vision for the country. The Chief also has a dual role as manager of the staffs of both the WHO and the Executive Office of the President, EOP. The Chief of Staff's first managerial task is to establish an organizational chart for the WHO. It should be simple and contain clear lines of authority and responsibility to avoid conflicts. It should also identify specific points of contact for each element of the government outside of the White House. These contacts should include the White House liaisons who are selected by the Office of Presidential Personnel, PPO. Receiving guidance from the President, the Chief endeavors to implement the President's agenda by setting priorities for the WHO. This process begins by taking stock of the President's campaign promises, identifying current and prospective opportunities, and then delegating policy priorities among the departments and agencies of the Cabinet and throughout the three White House Policy Councils, the National Economic Council, NEC, the Domestic Policy Council, DPC, and the National Security Council, NSC. The President is briefed on all of his policy priorities by his Cabinet and senior staff as directed by the Chief. The Chief, along with senior WHO staff, maps out the issues and themes that will be covered daily and weekly. The Chief then works with the policy councils, the Cabinet, and the Office of Communications and Office of Legislative Affairs, OLA, to sequence and execute the rollout of policies and announcements. White House counsel and senior advisors and senior counselors are also intimately involved. All senior staff report to the Chief of Staff, either directly or through his 2 or 3 deputies, unless the President determines that a particular assistant to the President reports directly to him. Most chiefs have interacted directly with cabinet officers and a select number of direct reports. In most cases, the direct reports to the chief are his 2 or 3 deputies, the communications director, PPO director, White House counsel, and senior advisors. Occasionally, the Office of Public Liaison, OPL, the Cabinet Secretary, and Intergovernmental Affairs, IGA, also report directly to the chief. Usually, however, they report instead to a Deputy Chief of Staff. The Chief of Staff's main challenge is time management. His use of his deputies, meetings with senior staff, and direction provided to the WHO must all balance with the daily needs of the President. A successful chief steers the West Wing using his management of an influence with the various individuals and entities around him. It goes without saying that selecting the right person to be chief is vital. Deputy Chiefs of Staff. In recent years, presidents typically have appointed 2 Deputy Chiefs of Staff, a Deputy Chief of Staff for Management and Operations and a Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy. There also have been other types of deputy chiefs whose roles have included, for example, overseeing strategy, planning, and implementation. Chiefs of staff have then occasionally appointed a principal deputy chief to be in charge of guiding decision-making, organizational structure, and information flow. Principal deputy chiefs of staff. Not all chiefs of staff have tapped a principal deputy. A major reason is that doing so adds another layer of command complexity. When principal deputies have been installed, their roles have varied based on the needs of particular chiefs. Most principal deputies have functioned as doorkeepers, sorting through action items, taking on those that can be handled at their own level, and passing up others that truly require the attention of the chief of staff or the president. Principal deputies also have assumed control of the scheduling functions, normally under the operations deputy, and have worked directly with the policy councils at the direction of the chief of staff. The OPL and Office of Political Affairs, OPA, also have reported to a principal deputy. Deputy Chief of Staff for Management and Operations. The Deputy Chief of Staff for Management and Operations oversees the President's schedule and all logistical aspects of his movement within and outside of the White House, for example, both air travel on Air Force One and Marine One and ground transportation. This deputy also interfaces directly with the Secret Service as well as the military offices tasked with keeping the President and his family safe. In the past, this deputy has also worked with the NSC, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, and the intelligence community and on advancing all foreign trips. If their roles are separated from that of the policy deputy, this deputy should have a strong grasp of international affairs and robust foreign policy credentials. This deputy further manages all facets of the working White House: technology, grounds management, support staff, personnel administration, and communications. This individual therefore needs to be meticulous and ideally should possess a great deal of command and control experience. Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy. In some administrations, the functions of the IGA, OPA, and OPL and other advisors within the WHO have fallen under the Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy. For conservatives, this arrangement could help to connect the WHO's outreach to political and external groups and be a strong conduit for state and local elected officials, state party organizations, and both grasshoppers and grassroots groups. This deputy chief works directly with the chief of staff, cabinet officers, and all 3 policy councils to support the development and implementation of the president's agenda. This deputy chief should therefore have impressive policy credentials in the realms of economic, domestic, and social affairs. Senior advisors. Presidents have surrounded themselves with senior advisors whose experience and interests are not necessarily neatly defined. In recent administrations, senior advisors have been appointed to offer broad guidance on political matters and communications issues. Others have acted as czars for specific projects or policy areas. The most powerful senior advisors frequently have had a long personal relationship with the president and often have spent a significant amount of time with him within and outside of the White House. They have been asked not only to provide guidance on a variety of policy issues, but also to offer instruction on communicating with the American people and the media. In a number of administrations, new offices or councils have been created to support senior advisors. For the most part, their functions have been duplicative or overlapping, as a result of which these offices have tended to be short-lived. Even so, senior advisors should be provided the staff and resources that their portfolios require. To ensure that senior advisors are effective, their portfolios must be clearly delineated and clearly communicated across the White House. This too is a responsibility of the Chief of Staff. Office of White House Counsel. The Office of White House Counsel provides legal guidance to the President and elements of the EOP on a host of issues, including presidential powers and privileges, ethics compliance, review of clemency applications, and judicial nominations. The selection of White House Counsel is one of the most important decisions an incoming president will make. The office is not designed to create or advance policies on its own initiative, nor should it do so. Rather, it is dedicated to guiding the president and his reports on how, within the bounds of the law, to pursue and realize the president's agenda. While the White House Counsel does not serve as the president's personal attorney in non-official matters, it is almost impossible to delineate exactly where an issue is strictly personal and has no bearing on the president's official function. The White House Counsel needs to be deeply committed both to the president's agenda and to affording the president proactive counsel and zealous representation. That individual directly advises the president as he performs the duties of the office, and this requires a relationship that is built on trust, confidentiality, and candor. The Office of White House Counsel is also responsible for ensuring that each component of the White House adheres to all applicable legal and ethical guidelines, which often requires ongoing training and monitoring to ensure compliance. This means ensuring that White House staff regularly consult with office attorneys on required financial disclosures, received gifts, potential conflicts of interest, and other ethical concerns. The Office of White House Counsel is the first line of defense for the EOP. Its staff must take seriously the duty to protect the powers and privileges of the President from encroachments by Congress, the judiciary, and the administrative components of departments and agencies. In addition to the White House Counsel, the office includes deputies, assistants, associates, and legal support staff. The assistant and associate attorneys are specialists in particular areas of the law and offer guidance to the EOP on issues related to national security, criminal law, environmental law, and a host of administrative and regulatory matters. Attorneys working in the Office of White House Counsel serve as legal advisors to the White House policy operation by reviewing executive orders, agency regulations, and other policy-related functions. Here again, subordinates should be deeply committed to the President's agenda and see their role as helping to accomplish the agenda through problem-solving and advocacy. They should not erect roadblocks out of an abundance of caution, rather, they should offer practical legal advice on how to promote the President's agenda within the bounds of the law. The White House Counsel's office cannot serve as a finishing school to credential the next set of white shoe law firm attorneys or federal judges in waiting who cabin their opinions for fear their elite credentials could be tarnished through a policy disagreement. Rather, it should function more as an activist yet ethical plaintiff's firm that advocates for its client, the administration's agenda, within the limits imposed by the Constitution and the duties of the legal profession. The Office of White House Counsel also serves as the primary gateway for communication between the White House and the Department of Justice, DOJ. Traditionally, both the White House Counsel and the Attorney General have issued a memo requiring all contact between the two institutions to occur only between the Office of White House Counsel and the Attorney General or Deputy Attorney General. The next administration should re-examine this policy and determine whether it might be more efficient or more appropriate for communication to occur through additional channels. The White House Counsel also works closely with the DOJ Office of Legal Counsel to seek opinions on, for example, matters of policy development and the constitutionality of presidential power and privileges, and with OLA and the DOJ Office of Legal Policy on presidential judicial nominees. When a new president takes office, he will need to decide expeditiously how to handle any major ongoing litigation or other pending legal matters that might present a challenge to his agenda. To offer guidance, the White House Counsel must get up to speed as quickly as possible on all significant ongoing legal challenges across the executive branch that might affect the new administration's policy agenda and must be prepared at the outset of the administration to present recommendations to the President, including recommendations for reconsidering or reversing positions of the previous administration in any significant litigation. This review will usually require consulting with the new political leadership at the Justice Department, including during the transition period. No day is predictable at the White House. Therefore, to handle the pace and volatility of affairs, the Office of White House Counsel must offer measured legal guidance in a timely manner. This often means foregoing law review-style memos about esoteric legal concepts and instead quickly providing high-level yet incisive guidance. Due to evolving world events, domestic affairs, and political pressures, the office often faces legal questions for which there may not be a wealth of precedent. Attorneys in the Office of White House Counsel must therefore work collaboratively within the White House and the Department of Justice, relying on each other as a team, to ensure that proper legal guidance is delivered to the President. The President should choose a White House Counsel who is well versed in the Constitution, administrative and regulatory law, and the inner workings of Congress and the political process. Instead of choosing a specialist, the President should hire a counsel with extensive experience with a wide range of complex legal subjects. Moreover, while a candidate with elite credentials might seem ideal, the best one will be above all loyal to the President and the Constitution. Staff Secretary. The office of the Staff Secretary is rarely visible to the outside world, but it performs work of tremendous importance. The office is similar to a military commander's adjutant as it is responsible for fielding and managing a vast amount of information at the top of its organization. This includes information on its way into the Oval Office as well as information flowing out from the Oval Office. Because of its gatekeeping function, the position of Staff Secretary is one of extreme trust, and the individual who possesses it should be vetted to work as an honest broker in the President's service. The office of the Staff Secretary has been described as the last substantive control point before papers reach the Oval Office. A great deal of information is headed toward the Oval Office at any moment. This includes presidential decision memos, bills passed by Congress, which may be accompanied by signing or veto statements, and briefing books, reading materials, samples of constituent mail, personal mail, and drafts of speeches. The staff secretary makes certain that these materials are complete, well-ordered, and up to date before they reach the president. This necessarily means that the staff secretary plays a key role in determining who weighs in on policy matters and when. As noted above, the staff secretary also handles information leaving the Oval Office. The president may have questions after reviewing incoming material, may wish to seek more information, or may demand revisions. The staff secretary is often responsible for directing these requests to the appropriate places and following up on them to ensure that they are completed. One of the staff secretary's critical functions is managing and overseeing the clearance process for the president's daily/nightly briefing book. This book is filled with all the reading material and leading documentation the president needs in the morning and the evening to help him make decisions. The staff secretary also oversees the use of the president's signature, whether by hand or by autopen, and manages the Office of the Executive Clerk, Office of Records Management, and Office of Presidential Correspondence. Office of Communications. The Office of Communications, which operates under the Director of Communications, conveys the president's agenda to the public through various media, including speeches and remarks, press briefings, off-the-record discussions with reporters, and social media. Depending on how a president chooses to structure his White House, the Office of Communications may include the Office of the Press Secretary, Press Office, but no matter how it is structured, the office must work closely with the press office as well as the president's speechwriters and digital strategists. Operational functions of the Office of Communications include scheduling and running press briefings, interviews, meetings, media appearances, speeches, and a range of other events. The Office of Communications must maintain robust relationships with the White House Press Corps, the White House Correspondents Association, regional stakeholders, and key interest groups. No legal entitlement exists for the provision of permanent space for media on the White House campus, and the next administration should re-examine the balance between media demands and space constraints on the White House premises. Leadership within the Office of Communications should include a communications director, who is a direct report to the Chief of Staff, a deputy communications director, a deputy director for strategic communications, and a press secretary. This leadership team must work together closely to drive the national narrative about the White House. The best resource for the Office of Communications is the President. The President conveys the White House's overall message through one or two inaugural addresses, State of the Union addresses, speeches to Congress, and press conferences. The office must also ensure that the various White House offices disseminate a unified message to the public. The communications director and press secretary in particular should be careful to avoid contradicting the president or delivering conflicting information. The speechwriting team is a critical component of the communications team. Speechwriting is a unique talent. The writers selected must understand policy, should have a firm grasp of history and other liberal arts disciplines, and should be able to learn and adopt the president's style of rhetoric and mode of delivery. The press secretary is the president's spokesperson, communicating to the American people through the media. The press secretary engages with the White House Press Corps formally through press briefings and informally through impromptu gaggles and meetings. Individuals who serve in this role must be quick on their feet, which means, when appropriate, deftly refuting and rebutting correspondents' questions and comments. The communications director must convey the president's mission to the American people. Especially for conservatives, this means navigating the mainstream media to ensure that the president's agenda is conveyed effectively and accurately. The communications director must be politically savvy and very aware of the ongoing activities of the other White House offices. The new administration should examine the nature of the relationship between itself and the White House Correspondents Association and consider whether an alternative coordinating body might be more suitable. Office of Legislative Affairs, OLA. Created by President Dwight Eisenhower, the OLA has continued to serve as the liaison between the White House and Congress. The White House must work with congressional leaders to ensure presidential nominees, for roles such as cabinet secretaries and ambassadors, are confirmed by the Senate. The White House also relies on Congress to enact reforms promised by the president on the campaign trail, whether those promises relate to health care, education, or national defense. Because Congress holds the power of the purse, White House staffers must ensure that there is enough support on the Hill to secure the necessary funding through the appropriations process to fulfill the president's agenda. The OLA reports directly to the Chief of Staff and in some administrations has done so under the guidance of a Deputy Chief of Staff, usually the Deputy Chief for Policy. Regardless of the person to whom the OLA reports, however, the office exercises a certain autonomy on behalf of the President and the Chief of Staff in directly influencing congressional leaders of both major political parties. The OLA often must function as the mediator among the parties and find common ground to facilitate the successful enactment of the President's agenda. As is the case with many White House offices, but especially the Office of Communications, the OLA must ensure that congressional leaders receive one unified message. If other actors within the White House maintain their own relationships with congressional leaders and staffers, it may appear that the president's agenda is fractured and lacks consensus. This dynamic has caused real problems for many presidents in the past. Internally, OLA staffers need to be involved in policy discussions, budget reviews, and other important meetings. They must also provide advice to policy staffers regarding whether certain ideas are politically feasible. Externally, OLA staffers have to communicate continuously with congressional offices of both parties in both the House and the Senate to ensure that the president has enough support to enact his legislative priorities or sustain votes. The OLA requires staffers who are effective communicators and can provide a dose of reality to other White House staffers when necessary. Although a policy proposal from within the White House may be a great idea, OLA staffers must ensure that it is politically feasible. OLA staffers must therefore be skilled in both politics and policy. Furthermore, the president should seek out individuals who can advance his agenda and at the same time forge pathways with members of the opposing political party on other priorities. Most important, the OLA must function as a well-oiled machine, precisely synced. The president cannot afford to have a tennis player on, much less as the leader of his football team. Office of Presidential Personnel, PPO. The political axiom that personnel is policy was popularized under President Ronald Reagan during the 1981 presidential transition. One of the most important offices in the White House is the PPO, which was created under President Richard Nixon to centralize political appointments. Departments and agencies had and still have direct legal authority on hiring and firing, but the power to fulfill Schedule C positions, the core of political jobs, is vested with the president. Therefore, the White House, not the department or agency, has the final word on political appointments. PPO's primary responsibility is to staff the executive branch with individuals who are equipped to implement the president's agenda. Although its focus should be identifying and recruiting leaders to fill the approximately 1,000 appointments that require Senate confirmation, PPO must also fill approximately 3,000 political jobs that require dedicated conservatives to support the administration's political leadership. Frequently, many medium-tier and top-tier jobs have been filled by policy experts tasked with accomplishing much of the work of the administration. At the same time, appointees in the entry-level jobs have brought invaluable energy and commitment to the White House and have proved to be the farm team for the conservative movement. The Office of Presidential Personnel is responsible for identifying potential political personnel both actively through recruitment and passively by fielding resumes and adjudicating requests from political actors. Vetting potential political personnel by conducting political background checks and reviewing any clearance and fitness assessments by departments and agencies. Making recommendations to the president and to other appointment authorities on behalf of the president. Identifying programmatic political workforce needs early in developing plans, for example, Schedule F. Maintaining a strong relationship with the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, both for operational purposes and to effectuate the President's direct Title V authorities. The President is in charge of the federal workforce and exercises control principally by working through the Director of the Office of Personnel Management. Training and connecting political personnel. Playing bad cop in a way that other White House offices cannot. Including serving as the office that takes direct responsibility for fires and hirings. Serving as a personnel link between conservative organizations and the executive branch. In most administrations, PPO will staff more than 100 positions during a transition and thousands of non-career positions during the president's first term. Direct authority and a strong relationship with the president are necessary attributes for any PPO director. Historically, PPO has had direct review and control of personnel files, including security clearance dossiers. At the highest level, PPO is tasked with long-term, strategic workforce development. The billets of political appointments are of immense importance in credentialing and training future leaders. In addition, whatever one's view of the constitutionality of various civil service rules, for example, the Federal Vacancies Reform Act of 19986, might be, it is necessary to ensure that departments and agencies have robust cadres of political staff just below senior levels in the event of unexpected vacancies. Office of Political Affairs, OPA. The OPA is the primary office within the executive branch for managing the president's political interests. Although its specific functions vary from administration to administration, the OPA typically serves as the liaison between the president and associated political entities, national committees, federal and state campaigns, and interest groups. Within legal guidelines, the OPA engages in outreach, conducts casework, and if the president is up for re-election, assists with his campaign. The OPA may also monitor congressional campaigns, arrange presidential visits with other political campaigns, and recommend campaign staff to the Office of Presidential Personnel for service in the executive branch. The OPA further serves as a line of communication between the White House and the president's political party. This includes both relaying the president's ambitions to political interests and listening to the needs of political interests. This relationship allows for the exchange of information between the White House and political actors across the country. The OPA should have one director of political affairs who reports either to the Chief of Staff or to a Deputy Chief of Staff. The OPA should also include various deputy directors, each of whom is responsible for a certain geographical region of the country. Because nearly all White House activities are in some way inherently political, the OPA needs to be aware of all presidential actions and activities, including travel, policy decisions, speeches, nominations, and responses to matters of national security, and consider how they might affect the president's image. The OPA must therefore have a designated staffer who communicates not only with other White House offices, but also with the Cabinet and executive branch agencies. Office of Cabinet Affairs, OCA. The OCA's role has changed to some degree over the course of various administrations, but its overriding function remains the same, to ensure the coordination of policy and communication between the White House and the Cabinet. Most important, the OCA coordinates all Cabinet meetings with the President. It should also organize and administer regular meetings of the deputy secretaries because they also typically serve vital roles in the departments and agencies and, further, often become acting secretaries when cabinet members resign. There should be one cabinet secretary who reports to the Chief of Staff's office, either directly or through a deputy chief, according to the chief's preference and focus. The cabinet secretary maintains a direct relationship with all members of the cabinet. The OCA further consists of deputies and special assistants who work with each department's principal, deputy secretary, undersecretaries, assistant secretaries, and other senior staff. The OCA also connects the departments to WHO offices. The OCA coordinates with the Chief of Staff's office and the Office of Communications to promote the President's agenda through the cabinet departments and agencies. The Cabinet's communications staffers are obviously another critical component of this operation. In prior administrations, the OCA has played a vital role by tracking the President's agenda for the Chief of Staff, deputy chiefs, and senior advisors. It has worked with each department and agency to advance policy priorities. In the future, amplifying this function would truly benefit both the President and the conservative movement. From time to time throughout an administration, travel optics, ethics challenges, and Hatch Act issues involving cabinet members, deputies, and senior staffers can arise. The OCA is normally tasked with keeping the WHO informed of such developments and providing support if and when necessary. The ideal cabinet secretary will have exceptional organizational skills and be a seasoned political operative or attorney. Because many cabinet officials have been former presidential candidates, governors, ambassadors, and members of Congress, the ideal candidate should also possess the ability to interact with and persuade accomplished individuals. Office of Public Liaison, OPL. The OPL is critically important in building coalitions and support for the President's agenda across every aligned social, faith-based, minority, and economic interest group. It is a critical tool for shaping public opinion and keeping myriad supporters, as well as frenemies and opponents alike who are within reach, better informed. The OPL is a notably large office. It should have one director who reports to the Chief of Staff's office, either directly or through a deputy, according to the Chief's preference and focus. The director must maintain relationships not only with other WHO heads, but also with the senior staff of every cabinet department and agency. Since a president's agenda is always in motion, it is important for the OPL to facilitate listening sessions to receive the views of the various leaders and MEM bears of key interest groups. The OPL should also have a sufficient number of deputies and special assistants to cover the vast number of disparate interest groups that are engaged daily. The OPL has, by far, held more meetings in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, EEOB, and within the West Wing itself than any other office within the WHO. The OPL is the chief White House enforcer and gatekeeper among these various interest groups. It has operated best whenever the Chief of Staff has given it permission to use both the proverbial carrot and the proverbial stick. To make this work, communication with the Chief's office is vital. Additionally, the OPL has had an outsized role in presidential scheduling in both official and political travel. The OPL director should come from the president's election campaign or Capitol Hill, but should not have deeply entrenched connections to a K Street entity or any other potential stakeholder. Some prior relationships can create real or perceived biases toward one group or another. The director should be amiable, gregarious, highly organized, and willing to shoulder criticism and pushback from interest groups and other elements of the administration. Unlike the director, OPL deputies and special assistants need a deep understanding of the Capitol, from K Street to Capitol Hill. They should have extensive experience in private industry, the labor sector, the conservative movement, and among the specific interest groups with which they will be asked to engage on behalf of the White House. OPL staffers work with more external and internal parties than any other WHO staffers. In turn, they must be effective communicators and initiative takers. They must also be able to influence, persuade, and most important, listen to various stakeholders and ensure that they feel heard. All OPL staffers must understand from the outset that their jobs might be modified or even phased out entirely as the administration's priorities change. Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, IGA. The IGA connects the White House to state, county, local, and tribal governments. In other words, it is the one-stop shop for disseminating an administration's agenda to all non-federal government entities. The IGA should have a director to whom 1 or 2 deputy directors report. The director must ensure that the White House remains connected to all non-federal government entities. The interests and perspectives of these entities are represented in policy discussions, organized events with the West Wing, EOP senior staff, and IGA staff throughout the departments and agencies. The IGA can be staffed in a variety of ways, but 2 arrangements are most common. Each deputy and that deputy's staffers are responsible for a type of government. A group of staffers is responsible for a specific geographical region of the country. The IGA, as suggested above, represents the interests and perspectives of non-federal government entities, but its primary job is to make sure that these entities understand an administration's agenda and ultimately support it. The IGA must work with all other White House offices, especially the OPA and the OPL, and manage its staff throughout the departments and agencies. IGA staffers must therefore have communication skills, understand political nuance, and be willing to engage in complex policy discussions. They should also be not just generally responsive, but also proactive in seeking out the interests and perspectives of non-federal government entities. White House Policy Councils. As the federal government has ballooned in size over the past century, it has become increasingly difficult for the president alone to direct his agenda across the executive branch. 3 White House Policy Councils have come into existence to help the president to control the bureaucracy and ensure continued alignment between agency leadership and White House priorities. Those councils, as previewed above, are the NSC, NEC, and DPC. Each is headed by an assistant to the president and performs 3 significant functions. Policy coordination. The primary role of the policy councils is to coordinate the development of administration policy. This frequently includes developing significant legislative priorities, coordinating policy decisions that impact multiple departments and agencies, and at times coordinating policy decisions within a single department or agency. This process must ensure that all relevant offices are included, that competing or conflicting opinions are thoroughly discussed and evaluated, and, when there is disagreement among White House senior staff or among cabinet members, a well-structured question is presented to the president for an intermediate or final decision. Policy advice. By virtue of working in the White House, the heads of the 3 policy councils will also function as independent policy advisors to the president. This aspect of the role will vary depending on the individual in this position and the president's governing philosophy. Incumbents have ranged from honest brokers, who mostly coordinate and ensure that all opinions are fairly presented to the president, to policy deciders, who largely drive a given policy topic on behalf of the president. Policy implementation. The policy councils also manage and mediate the implementation of previous policy decisions. Implementation of a new statute or an executive order frequently takes years and involves many distinct and more granular policy decisions along the way. It is essential to have a centralized process for evaluating and coordinating these decisions, especially if they involve more than one cabinet department or agency with differing opinions on the best approach for securing the president's goals. The above functions have recently been managed by policy councils through a tiered interagency policy process. This process helps to identify differences of opinion and reach a decision without having to take every issue to the president. It can be used to address a single question or monitor a recurring issue on an ongoing basis. Typically, the process involves multiple cabinet departments and agencies that have a pertinent role, policy interest, or disagreement. Each policy council's process could involve the following committees: Policy Coordinating Committee, PCC. A PCC is led by a special assistant to the president from the policy council and includes political assistant secretary-level experts from the relevant departments, agencies, or offices. The purpose is to determine where consensus exists, clearly identify where there are differing opinions, and develop options for resolving the remaining questions. If no outstanding questions or disagreements exist, the PCC may resolve the issue and move toward implementation at the agency level. Deputies Committee, DC. A DC is a meeting of presidentially appointed executives chaired by the Policy Council's deputy assistant to the president and relevant deputy secretaries. It evaluates the options produced by the PCC and frequently directs the PCC to add, expand, or reevaluate an option or even to reach a compromise and resolve an issue at that level. Principals Committee, PC. When questions are not resolved by a DC, the Director of the Policy Council will chair a PC, which is attended by the relevant cabinet secretaries and senior White House political staff. This is the final opportunity for the President's most senior advisors to discuss the question, make sure that each principal's position is carefully understood, and see whether consensus or a compromise might be reached. If not, the Chief of Staff's office will schedule time for the PC to meet with the President for a final decision. Despite having seemingly clear and separate portfolios, the three policy councils frequently have areas of overlap, which can result in confusion, duplication, or conflict. For example, there are the areas of immigration and border security, either NSC or DPC, healthcare, energy, and environment, either NEC or DPC, and trade and international economic policy, either NSC or NEC. Identifying these potentially problematic areas and assigning policy responsibilities to only one council where possible will help to speed up the policy coordination process. While other chapters will cover specific policy goals for each department or agency, incoming policy councils will need to move rapidly to lead policy processes around cross-cutting agency topics, including countering China, enforcing immigration laws, reversing regulatory policies in order to promote energy production, combating the left's aggressive attacks on life and religious liberty, and confronting wokeism throughout the federal government. National Security Council. The NSC is intended to be an interdepartmental body within the White House that can set national security policy with a whole-of-government approach. Unlike the other policy councils, the NSC was established by statute. Statutory members and advisors who are currently part of the NSC include the President and Vice President, the Secretaries of State, Defense, and Energy, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Director of National Intelligence. The NSC staff, and particularly the National Security Advisor, should be vetted for foreign and security policy experience and insight. The National SECurity Advisor and NSC staff advise the President on matters of foreign policy and national security, serve as an information conduit in times of crisis, and as liaisons ensuring that written communications are properly shared among NSC members. Special attention should be given to the use of detailees to staff the NSC. In recent years, the NSC's staff size has been right-sized from its peak of 400 in 2015 down to 100 to 150 professional members. The next administration should try to limit the number of details to ensure more direct presidential control. National Economic Council. The NEC was established in 1993 by executive order and has four key functions: L to coordinate the economic policy-making process with respect to domestic and international economic issues. To coordinate economic policy advice to the President. To ensure that policy decisions and programs are consistent with the President's stated goals and that those goals are being effectively pursued. To monitor implementation of the President's economic policy agenda. The NEC Director coordinates and implements the President's economic policy objectives by working with Cabinet Secretaries, their departments, and multiple agencies. The Director is supported by a staff of policy experts in various fields, including infrastructure, manufacturing, research and development, agriculture, small business, financial regulation, housing, technology and innovation, and fiscal policy. The NEC considers economic policy matters, and the DPC typically considers anything related to domestic matters with the exception of economic policy matters. It also differs from the Council of Economic Advisors, CEA. Whereas the NEC is in charge of policy development, the CEA acts as the White House's internal research arm for economic analysis. It is therefore critically important to find people with the right qualifications to head both the NEC and the CEA. The CEA is almost always led by a well-known academic economist, and the NEC is regularly led by someone with expertise in directing the President's economic policy process. Those who have served in the role have ranged from former CEOs of the nation's largest investment firms to financial services industry managers to seasoned congressional staffers who have managed the economic policy issues for top financial and tax writing committees. Domestic Policy Council. The Domestic Policy Council, DPC, consists of advisors to the President on non-economic domestic policy issues as well as international issues with a significant domestic component, such as immigration. It is one of the primary policy councils serving the President along with the NSC and NEC. The Director serves as the principal DPC advisor to the President, along with members of the Cabinet, and the Deputy Director chairs the committee responsible for coordinating domestic policy development at the Deputy Secretary level. In this respect, both the Director and the Deputy Director have critical institutional functions that affect the development of domestic policy throughout the administration. The DPC also has policy experts, for example, special assistants to the President or SAPs, who are responsible for developing and coordinating, as well as for advising the President on specific issues. It is essential that DPC policy expertise reflect the most prominent issues that are before the administration, issues such as the environment, healthcare, housing, and immigration. In addition, DPC SAPs should demonstrate a working knowledge of the rulemaking process, although they need not necessarily be experts on regulation, because a working knowledge of the rulemaking process will facilitate the DPC's effectiveness in coordinating administration policy. The DPC also needs to work closely with other offices within the Executive Office of the President to promote economic opportunity and private sector innovation. This includes working with the Office of Management and Budget and its Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, as well as the Council of Economic Advisors, Council on Environmental Quality, and Office of Science and Technology Policy. To this end, the director should chair a standing meeting with the principals from each of the other EOP offices to enhance coordination from within the White House. Several areas will be especially important as the DPC works to develop a well-defined domestic policy agenda. One is the promotion of innovation as a foundation for economic growth and opportunity. The President should establish an economic opportunity working group, chaired by the DPC director, to coordinate the development of policies that promote economic opportunity. Another important area is the promotion of healthcare reform to bring down costs for the American people and the pressure that spending on health programs puts on the federal budget. Finally, DPC should coordinate with the NSC on a policy agenda to enhance border security. Office of the Vice President, OVP. In modern U.S. history, the Vice President has acted as a significant advisor to the President. Once elected, the VP helps to promote and, in many instances, put into place and execute the President's agenda. The President may additionally determine the inclusion of OVP staff in White House meetings, including Policy Coordinating Committee, Deputies Committee, and Principals Committee discussions, as has been done in various recent administrations. Recent presidents have decided to give Vice Presidents space in the West Wing. The VP's proximity to the President, as well as to the Chief of Staff and additional senior advisors, makes his or her role a powerful one within the West Wing. Presidents typically tap VPs to lead various administration efforts. These efforts have included serving on the NSC Principals Committee, heading the National Space Council, addressing immigration and border issues, leading the response to the healthcare crisis, and supervising workforce programs. VPs traditionally also spearhead projects of personal interest that have been authorized by the President. The VP is also charged with breaking tie votes in the Senate and in recent years has served abroad as a brand ambassador for the White House and more broadly the United States, announcing administration priorities and coordinating with heads of state and other top foreign government officials. The Vice President, as President of the Senate, could be a President's emissary to the Senate. Office of the First Lady/First Gentleman. The First Lady or First Gentleman plays an interesting role in the formation, implementation, and execution of policy in concert with the President. Active and interested first spouses often champion a select number of signature issues, whether they be thorny social issues or deeper policy issues. One advantage of the first spouses taking on hot-button social issues is that any political backlash will be less severe than it would be for the President. The first spouse normally appoints a chief of staff who has enough assistance to support the spouse's activities in the East Wing of the White House. This group works exclusively with the first spouse and senior members of the White House along with EOP personnel to implement and execute the first spouse's priorities, which reflect the first spouse's passions and interests and are often identified as important in discussions with the President. Executed well, they can be strategically useful in accelerating the administration's agenda. Past East Wing initiatives have focused on such issues as combating bullying, fighting drug abuse, promoting literacy, and encouraging physical education for young adults and children. The first spouse is afforded significant resources. His or her staff also works with the President's policy team, members of the Cabinet, and other EOP staff. Title III, Executive Office of the President of the United States. In its opening words, Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution makes it abundantly clear that, he executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America. One, that enormous power is not vested in departments or agencies, in staff or administrative bodies, in non-governmental organizations or other equities and interests close to the government. The President must set and enforce a plan for the executive branch. Sadly, however, a president today assumes office to find a sprawling federal bureaucracy that all too often is carrying out its own policy plans and preferences, or, worse yet, the policy plans and preferences of a radical, supposedly woke faction of the country. The modern conservative president's task is to limit, control, and direct the executive branch on behalf of the American people. This challenge is created and exacerbated by factors like Congress's decades-long tendency to delegate its lawmaking power to agency bureaucracies, the pervasive notion of expert independence that protects so-called expert authorities from scrutiny, the presumed inability to hold career civil servants accountable for their performance, and the increasing reality that many agencies are not only too big and powerful, but also increasingly weaponized against the public and a president who is elected by the people and empowered by the Constitution to govern. In Federalist No. 47, James Madison warned that, he accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. Regrettably, that wise and cautionary note describes to a significant degree the modern executive branch, which, whether controlled by the bureaucracy or by the president, writes federal policy, enforces that policy, and often adjudicates whether that policy was properly drafted and enforced. The overall situation is constitutionally dire, unsustainably expensive, and in urgent need of repair. Nothing less than the survival of self-governance in America is at stake. The great challenge confronting a conservative president is the existential need for aggressive use of the vast powers of the executive branch to return power, including power currently held by the executive branch, to the American people. Success in meeting the challenge will require a rare combination of boldness and self-denial, boldness to bend or break the bureaucracy to the presidential will and self-denial to use the bureaucratic machine to send power away from Washington and back to America's families, faith communities, local governments, and states. Fortunately, a president who is willing to lead will find in the Executive Office of the President, EOP, the levers necessary to reverse this trend and impose a sound direction for the nation on the federal bureaucracy. The effectiveness of those EOP levers depends on the fundamental premise that it is the president's agenda that should matter to the departments and agencies that operate under his constitutional authority, and that, as a general matter, it is the president's chosen advisors who have the best sense of the president's aims and intentions, both with respect to the policies he intends to enact and with respect to the interests that must be secured to govern successfully on behalf of the American people. This chapter focuses on key features of and recommendations for several of the EOP's important components. U.S. Office of Management and Budget, OMB. OMB assists the President in the execution of his policy agenda across the government by employing many statutory and executive procedural levers to bring the bureaucracy in line with all budgetary, regulatory, and management decisions. Properly understood, it is a President's air traffic control system with the ability in charge to ensure that all policy initiatives are flying in sync and with the authority to let planes take off and, at times, ground planes that are flying off course. OMB's key roles include developing and enforcing the President's budget and executing the appropriations laws that fund the government, managing agency and personnel performance, procurement policy, financial management, and information technology, developing the President's regulatory agenda, reviewing new regulatory actions, reviewing federal information collections, and setting and enforcing federal information policy, and coordinating and clearing agency communications with Congress, including testimonies and views on draft legislation. OMB cannot perform its role on behalf of the President effectively if it is not intimately involved in all aspects of the White House policy process and lacks knowledge of what the agencies are doing. Internally to the EOP, ensuring that the policy formulation procedures developed by the White House to serve the President include OMB is one of any OMB director's major responsibilities. A common meme of those who intend to evade OMB review is to argue that where resources are not being discussed, OMB's participation is optional. This ignores both OMB's role in all downstream execution and the reality that it has the only statutory tools in the White House that are powerful enough to override implementing agencies' bureaucracies. The director must view his job as the best, most comprehensive approximation of the President's mind as it pertains to the policy agenda while always being ready with actual options to effect that agenda within existing legal authorities and resources. This role cannot be performed adequately if the director acts instead as the ambassador of the institutional interests of OMB and the wider bureaucracy to the White House. Once its reputation as the keeper of commander's intent is established, then and only then does OMB have the ability to shape the most efficient way to pursue an objective. Externally, the director must ensure that OMB has sufficient visibility into the deep caverns of agency decision-making. One indispensable statutory tool to that end is to ensure that policy officials, the program associate directors, PADs, managing the vast resource management offices, RMOs, personally sign what are known as the apportionments. In 1870, Congress passed the Anti-Deficiency Act to prevent the common agency practice of spending down all appropriated funding, creating artificial funding shortfalls that Congress would have to fill. The law mandated that all funding be allocated or apportioned in installments. This process, whereby agencies come to OMB for allotments of appropriated funding, is essential to the effective financial stewardship of taxpayer dollars. OMB can then direct on behalf of a president the amount, duration, and purpose of any appropriated funding to ensure against waste, fraud, and abuse and ensure consistency with the president's agenda and applicable laws. The vast majority of these apportionments were signed by career officials, the deputy associate directors, DADs, until the Trump administration placed this responsibility in the hands of the PADs and thereby opened wide vistas of oversight that had escaped the attention of policy officials. The Biden administration subsequently reversed this decision. No director should be chosen who is unwilling to restore apportionment decision-making to the PAD's personal review, who is not aggressive in wielding the tool on behalf of the president's agenda, or who is unable to defend the power against attacks from Congress. It should be noted that each of OMB's primary functions, along with other executive and statutory roles, is carried out with the help of many essential OMB support offices. The two most important offices for moving OMB at the will of a director are the Budget Review Division, BRD, and the Office of General Counsel, OGC. The director should have a direct and effective relationship with the head of the BRD, considered the top career official within OMB, and transmit most instructions through that office because the rest of the agency is institutionally inclined toward its direction and responds accordingly. The BRD inevitably will translate the directions from policy officials to the career staff, and at every stage, it is obviously vital that the director ensure that this translation is an accurate one. In addition, many key considerations involved in enacting a president's agenda hinge on existing legal authorities. The director must ensure the appointment of a general counsel who is respected yet creative and fearless in his or her ability to challenge legal precedents that serve to protect the status quo. This is vital within OMB not only with respect to the adequate development of policy options for the president's review, but also with respect to agencies that attempt to protect their own institutional interests and foreclose certain avenues based on the mere assertion, and not proof, that the law disallows it or that, conversely, attempt to disregard the clear statutory commands of Congress. In general, the director should empower a strong deputy director with authority over the Deputy for Management, the PADs, and the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, to work diligently to break down barriers within OMB and not allow turf disputes or a lack of visibility to undermine the agency's principal budget, management, and regulatory functions. OMB should work toward a one OMB position on behalf of the President and represent that view during the various policymaking processes. Budget. The United States today faces an untenable fiscal situation and owes $31 trillion on a debt that is steadily increasing. The OMB director should present a fiscal goal to the President early in the budget development process to address the federal government's fiscal irresponsibility. This goal would help to align the months-long process of developing the actual proposals for inclusion in the budget. Though some mistakenly regard it as a mere paper-pushing exercise, the President's budget is in fact a powerful mechanism for setting and enforcing public policy at federal agencies. The budget team includes 6 resource management offices that, together with the BRD and other components, help the director of OMB to develop and execute detailed agency spending plans that bear on every major aspect of policy formation and execution at federal agencies. Through initial priority setting and ongoing supervision of agency spending, OMB's budget team plays a key role in executing policy across the executive branch, including at many agencies wrongly regarded as independent. The RMOs, each of which is led by a political appointee known as the PAD and a career DAD, are separated into 6 functional units: national security, natural resources, energy, and science, health, education, income maintenance, and labor, transportation, justice, and homeland security, treasury, commerce, and housing. Because the RMOs are institutionally ingrained in nearly all policymaking and implementation across the executive branch, they play a critical role in helping the director to implement the president's public policy agenda. However, because each RMO is responsible for formulating and supervising such a wide range of policy details, many granular but critical policy decisions are effectively left to the career professionals who serve across administrations. To enhance the OMB director's ability to help the president drive policy at the agencies, the existing 6 RMOs should be divided into smaller subject matter areas, allowing for more PADs, and each of these PADs should have a deputy PAD. This expanded pool of RMOs with additional political leadership would enable more comprehensive direction and oversight of policy development and implementation. Regardless of whether Congress adopts the president's full set of budget recommendations, the president should reintroduce the concept of administrative pay-as-you-go, or administrative PAYGO. This simple procedural requirement imposes budget neutrality on the discretionary choices of federal agencies, of which there are many in nearly all areas of policymaking. This simple step forces the executive branch to control what it can control. The principle may occasionally yield to other overarching requirements, such as a presidential regulatory budget, but in nearly all cases, administrative PAYGO plays a unique and indispensable role in enforcing fiscal responsibility at federal departments and agencies. The president should use every possible tool to propose and impose fiscal discipline on the federal government. Anything short of that would constitute abject failure. Management. The Management Office of OMB, the M-side as it is often called, is responsible for carrying out several important agency oversight functions, many of which are statutory. The management team includes the following offices led by presidentially appointed Senate-confirmed individuals: the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, OFPP; the Office of Performance and Personnel Management, OPPM; the Office of Federal Financial Management, OFFM; the Office of the Federal Chief Information Officer, OFCIO; the Made in America Office, MIAO, which was added by the Biden administration and is not a Senate-confirmed slot. Each of these offices has responsibilities and authorities that a president can use to help drive policy across the government. It is vital that the director and his political staff, not the careerists, drive these offices in pursuit of the president's actual priorities and not let them set their own agenda based on the wishes of the sprawling good government management community in and outside of government. Many directors do not properly prioritize the management portfolio, leaving it to the deputy for management, but such neglect creates purposeless bureaucracy that impedes a president's agenda and M-train to nowhere. OFPP. This office plays a critical role in leading the development of new policies and regulations concerning federal contracting and procurement. Through the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council, which is generally chaired by the OFPP administrator, OFPP helps the director to set a wide range of policies for all of those who contract with the executive branch. In the past, those government-wide contracting rules have played a key role in helping to implement the president's policy agenda. This office should be engaged early and often in OMB's effort to drive policy, including by obtaining transparency about entities that are awarded federal contracts and grants and by using government contracts to push back against woke policies in corporate America. OPPM. Through this office, the director helps federal agencies to establish their performance goals and performance review processes. OPPM also works with the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, OPM, to establish and manage personnel policies and practices across the federal government. The director should instruct OPPM to establish annual performance goals and review processes for agencies that reflect the president's agenda. OPPM should also be part of the president's strategy to set and enforce sensible policies and practices for the federal workforce. OFFM. This office helps the director to root out waste, fraud, and abuse in federal programs, for example, through the Do Not Pay program. It should be part of efforts to save precious taxpayer resources. OFCIO. This office guides the federal government's use and adoption of internet-based technologies to improve government operations and save taxpayer money. As a function of its leadership role, it is critical in interagency discussions on a wide range of technology issues. The office thus is an important part of the president's efforts to modernize, strengthen, and set technology adoption policy for the executive branch. Meow. Building on the example and work of the Trump administration, President Biden established this office to centralize, carry out, and further develop the federal government's Buy American and other Made in America commitments. Its work ought to be continued and further strengthened. Regulatory and information policy. OMB's OIRA plays an enormous and vital role in reigning in the regulatory state and ensuring that regulations achieve important benefits while imposing minimal burdens on Americans. The President should maintain Executive Order, EO, 12866, the foundation of OIRA's review of regulatory actions. The administration should likewise maintain the recent extension of those standards to regulatory actions of the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Regulatory analysis and OIRA review should also be required of the historically independent agencies, as the Office of Legal Counsel has found is legally permissible. If the current administration proceeds with its declared intent to modify aspects of EO 12866 or review OMB Circular A4, the related document that provides the foundation for cost-benefit analysis, the next president should immediately begin to undo those changes and develop a rigorous, data-driven approach that will result in the least burdensome rules possible. The next president should also revive the Directive and Executive Order 13891 that significant guidance documents also must pass through OIRA review. Because OIRA review often leads to fewer regulatory burdens, more regulatory benefits, and better coordination of regulatory policy, funding for OIRA tends to pay large dividends. Yet over the years, funding for OIRA has diminished. This trend should be reversed. The budget should also include sufficient full-time equivalent (FTE) employees to form regulatory advance teams that would consult with agencies on cost-benefit analysis and good regulatory practices at the beginning of the rulemaking process for the most important regulations. These teams would help agencies take cost-benefit analysis into account from the beginning of their rulemaking efforts, which in turn would result in higher quality regulations and a swifter eventual OIRA review. To preserve the integrity of OIRA review, the staff who consult at the beginning of a rulemaking should not handle its eventual review. The next president should also reinstate the many executive orders signed by President Trump that were designed to make the regulatory process more just, efficient, and transparent. Executive Orders 13771, 13777, 13891, 13892, 13893, 13924 Section 6, 13979, and 13980 should be revived, with modifications as needed. Executive Order 13132 on federalism should be strengthened so that state regulatory and fiscal operations are not commandeered by the federal government through so-called cooperative federalism programs. Additionally, the President should revise and sign an updated version of President Ronald Reagan's Executive Order 12630 on federal takings. The next President should strengthen implementation of the Information Quality Act, robustly use the authority of the Paperwork Reduction Act, carefully enforce the Privacy Act, and ensure the sound execution of OIRA's statistical and other information policy functions. Regulatory cooperation agreements can also promote the further adoption of good regulatory practices, which improve market conditions for America and her allies. OIRA should also work with other components of OMB to revise and apply OMB's uniform guidance for grants and agreements and ensure that federal contract and grant guidelines satisfy EO 12866 and other centralized standards as appropriate. But executive reforms and actions, while vital, are not enough. Congress also must act. The next president should work with Congress to pass significant regulatory policy and process reforms, which could go a long way toward reigning in the administrative state. Excellent examples of such legislation include the Regulatory Accountability Act, SMART Act, GOOD Act, Early Participation in Regulations Act, Unfunded Mandates Accountability and Transparency Act, and REINS Act. Finally, the next president should work with Congress to maximize the utility of the Congressional Review Act, CRA, which allows Congress to undo midnight regulatory actions, including those disguised as guidance, on an accelerated timeline. To leverage the CRA's power to the maximum extent, Congress and the President should enact the Midnight Rules Relief Act, which would help to ensure that multiple regulatory actions could be packaged and voted on at the same time. Immediate and robust use of the CRA would allow the President to focus his rulemaking resources on major new regulatory reforms rather than devoting months or years to undoing the final rulemakings of the Biden administration. Legislative clearance and coordination. OMB plays a critical role in ensuring that the executive branch is aligned on legislative proposals and language, agency testimonies, and other communications with Congress. The director should use these authorities to enforce policy and message consistency aggressively and promote the effective engagement of the executive branch in legislative processes. National Security Council, NSC. The National Security Council, NSC, was established by statute to support the President in developing and implementing national security policy by coordinating across relevant departments and agencies, integrating authorities and resources toward common ends, and objectively assessing progress toward established goals. Led by the National Security Advisor, NSA, the NSC staff will be successful in implementing the President's national security goals only if it is made up of personnel with technical expertise and experience as well as an alignment to the President's declared national security policy priorities. The NSC must then chart a course that articulates and achieves the President's national security goals and objectives. The President should empower a strong NSC that not only has the power to convene the policy process, but also is entrusted with the full power of the Presidency to drive the bureaucracy. In organizing, by means of presidential directive, an NSC staff that is more responsive and aligned with the President's goals and empowered to implement them, the NSA should immediately evaluate and eliminate directorates that are not aligned with the President's agenda and replace them with new directorates as appropriate that can drive implementation of the President's signature national security priorities. In addition to realigning the staff organization to the President's priorities, the NSA should assign responsibility for implementation of specific policy initiatives to senior NSC officials from across the NSC staff structure. These officials should develop, direct, and execute tangible action plans in coordination with multiple agencies to achieve measurable, time-defined milestones. Aligning NSC staff to the President's national security goals will provide clearer direction, a mandate for action, and a baseline of accountability that can be used to evaluate staff performance and the NSC's overall progress. Accountable senior officials, themselves either political appointees or a minimum number of career detailees, who are selected and vetted politically and report directly to political staff, should be the main day-to-day managers for interagency coordination and implementation of their assigned national security policy objectives. They should provide policy analysis for consideration by the broader NSC and relevant agencies and ensure timely responses to decisions made by the President. The accountable senior officials should be established at the direction of the NSA and draw on personnel and expertise from beyond the NSC, including OMB, the National Economic Council, and relevant federal agencies. The NSC staff and principal should work in tandem with the National Economic Council and OMB at all levels, presenting a united effort to achieve the President's goals and drawing on the latter's statutory authorities to guide the bureaucracy. To accomplish national objectives effectively, foreign policy should fully incorporate the economic instruments of national power. National security policy must also include the prioritized allocation of resources. When policies are divorced from the resources required to implement them, they are stillborn academic exercises that undermine our national security and leave departments and agencies to their own devices. The accountable senior officials should be empowered to identify, recruit, clear, and hire staff who are aligned with and willing to shepherd the President's national security priorities. NSC staff leads, under the direction of the NSA, should have the discretion to reduce the number of positions that need high-level clearances, and the NSC should be adequately resourced and authorized to adjudicate and hold security clearances internally with investigators who work directly for the NSC and whose sole task is to clear NSC officials. If certain staff are determined not to need high-level clearances, the question becomes whether they should be part of the NSC at all. The NSC should take a leading role in directing the drafting and thorough review of all formal strategies, the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy Y, the Nuclear Posture Review, the Missile Defense Strategy, etc. In particular, the National Defense Strategy, which by tradition has evaded significant review, should be prioritized for White House review by the NSC and OMB. Both should also conduct reviews of operational war plans and global force planning and allocations with the Secretary of Defense to align them with presidential priorities and review all key policy and guidance intended for implementation by the heads of the Department of Defense, the Department of State, and the intelligence community before they are authorized for distribution. The NSC should rigorously review all general and flag officer promotions to prioritize the core roles and responsibilities of the military over social engineering and non-defense matters, including climate change, critical race theory, manufactured extremism, and other polarizing policies that weaken our armed forces and discourage our nation's finest men and women from enlisting to serve in defense of our liberty. The NSC staff will need to consolidate the functions of both the NSC and the Homeland Security Council, HSC, incorporate the recently established Office of the National Cyber Director, and evaluate the required regional and functional directorates. Given the aforementioned prerequisites, the NSC should be properly resourced with sufficient policy professionals, and the NSA should prioritize staffing the vast majority of NSC directorates with aligned political appointees and trusted career officials. For instance, the NSA should return all non-essential details to their home agencies on their first day in office so that the new administration can proceed efficiently without the personnel landmines left by the previous stewards, and as soon as possible should replace all essential detailees with staff aligned to the new president's priorities. The HSC has overseen pandemic response, and its incorporation is important. In the end, change requires intervention, and the NSC staff should be appropriately recruited, manned, and empowered to achieve the President's national security and foreign policy objectives and maintain robust policy analysis and discussion while minimizing resistance from those who have an agenda or who jealously guard their resources and autonomy at the expense of national security and sound policy development. This resistance and inertia can be inadvertently enabled by a small and unempowered NSC. Additionally, the White House Chief of Staff and NSA must ensure that the NSC is functioning in tandem with the rest of the White House staff to benefit from the best strategic thinking of the President's top advisors. History shows that an unsupervised NSC staff can stray from its statutory role and adversely affect a president and his policies. Moreover, while the NSC should be fully incorporated into the White House, it should also be allowed to do its job without the impediment of duly hatted staff that report to other offices. For instance, the NSC needs its own counsel to inform what legal options can be provided to the President. The White House counsel should be part of that policy process as the President's top legal advisor. These recommendations provide a clear roadmap for rapidly sizing and solidifying the NSC staff to support and achieve the President's objectives beginning on Inauguration Day. National Economic Council, NEC. The National Economic Council is one of the policy councils serving the President along with the NSC and the Domestic Policy Council, DPC. The director serves as principal advisor to the President on domestic and international economic policy and communicates the President's economic message to the media. the Deputy Director is responsible for the day-to-day operation of the Council, which includes chairing the committee that coordinates economic policy development at the Deputy Secretary level. In effect, the Director and Deputy Director are the officials who are primarily responsible for the development of economic policymaking for the administration. Once a policy is adopted, it is the appropriate agency's responsibility to implement it. The NEC's policy process is also used to determine whether the President should support or oppose legislation passed by Congress. In addition to its leadership, the NEC has policy experts, for example, special assistants to the President or SAPs, who are responsible for developing and coordinating, as well as advising the President, on specific issues. It is essential that the policy expertise of the NEC reflect the current environment's most pressing issues. Today, this would include, among other topics, taxes, energy and environment, technology, infrastructure, healthcare, financial services, workforce, agriculture, antitrust and competition policy, and retirement programs. NEC's SAPs should have a working knowledge of how the administration can implement policy through the rulemaking process, although it is not necessary that they be experts on regulation themselves, particularly given OMB's role. This will facilitate the NEC's effectiveness in coordinating administration policy. The NEC needs to work closely with other offices within the Executive Office of the President to promote innovation by the private sector and create an environment that will stimulate economic activity while reducing federal spending and debt. This includes working with the DPC, NSC, OMB, Council of Economic Advisers, Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, Office of Cabinet Affairs, White House Council, Council on Environmental Quality, Office of Legislative Affairs, and Office of Science and Technology Policy. To this end, the NEC Director should chair a standing meeting with the principals from each of the other EOP offices to enhance coordination from within the White House. In the past, there has been tension among the DPC, NEC, and NSC over jurisdiction. It is important to set clear jurisdictions at the start of an administration to prevent needless and counterproductive turf fights. In addition, the Principal Deputy for International Economic Policy is jointly appointed at NEC and NSC and could end up serving two different interests. To avoid such problems, international economic policy should be entirely coordinated from NEC. It will be especially important for the NEC to work seamlessly with the Council of Economic Advisers, CEA, which provides the President and the White House offices with the latest economic data and forecasts, as well as estimates of the economic impact of proposed policies, and prepares the annual economic report of the President. The CEA is not a policy council and therefore does not run policy processes, which is the responsibility of the NEC, DPC, and NSC. However, the CEA does play a key role in ensuring that any policy considered by the councils is rigorously evaluated for its economic impacts. The NEC works closely with the White House Office of Communications and Office of Speechwriting to ensure that the White House's messaging and media engagement communicate the President's economic policy effectively. The NEC also plays a key role in advancing the President's economic agenda by advising the Office of Presidential Personnel on appointments to key economic posts, including positions in financial regulatory agencies. The NEC helps to ensure that each economic post is held by a person who shares the President's policy priorities and works well with the rest of the administration's economic team. The financial regulators are run partly by civil servants, some of whom were political appointees in prior liberal administrations, who often resist a conservative administration's policies. It is therefore critical that an administration not only appoints capable individuals to lead these agencies, but also has personnel who can be hired into senior staff positions within the agencies. A few areas will be especially important if the NEC is to develop a well-defined economic policy agenda. One is the promotion of innovation as a foundation for economic growth and opportunity. Another is the creation of an environment that fosters economic growth through tax reform and the elimination of regulatory and procedural barriers. Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, USTR. The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative provides the President with the internal White House resources necessary to formulate and execute a unified, whole-of-government approach to trade policy. The President should ensure that the USTR is empowered to serve in that leadership role, much as other EOP components organize and drive a coordinated policy agenda on behalf of the President. The People's Republic of China's predatory trade practices have disrupted the open market trading system that has provided mutual benefit to all participating countries, including China, for decades. The failure of the World Trade Organization, WTO, to discipline China for abrogation of its trading commitments has seriously undermined its credibility and made it a largely ineffective institution. The United States, through an empowered USTR, must act to rebalance and refocus international trading relationships in favor of democratic nations that embrace free, fair, and open trade principles built on market-driven economies. Chapter 26 of this book outlines recommended trade policy priorities for the incoming president. However, regardless of the approach, successful implementation of that trade agenda will require the president to articulate a clear policy direction and instructions for the executive branch to operate in a coordinated fashion under the leadership of an empowered USTR. To address these and other challenges, protect the American worker, and secure free and open markets for our communities and businesses, the next president must leverage the institutional resources and strength of the USTR and neither allow institutional interests to drive a fragmented trade policy that is developed from the ground up nor cater to parochial interests across government and Washington's broader industry of influence. The USTR's mission is vitally important in reorienting the global trading system in a direction that is open, fair, and prosperous. In order to achieve the president's policy goals, a strong USTR must be empowered to set trade policy from the White House with the authority and resources to represent the interests of the president's trade agenda with adequate budget, staff, analysis, and expertise to engage meaningfully in internal and interagency policy deliberations. The USTR should organize and harness existing interagency trade committees to serve the president's trade agenda and drive a consensus among federal stakeholders, dispose of legacy advisory committees with members who serve special interests, direct action to implement policy priorities, measure progress toward implementing the president's agenda, and hold agencies and officials accountable for delivering the president's agenda. The USTR's leadership should not only coordinate and enforce the president's agenda across the federal community, but also set and enforce the president's trade agenda internally. Trade policy and priorities should be set by the president and implemented by the U.S. Trade Representative in cooperation with the other economic and national security officials, not by the range of governmental and non-governmental interests that attempt to force their policy preferences on the USTR. A strong USTR empowered with the necessary resources, authorities, and interagency cooperation will protect U.S. interests in the global marketplace more effectively. Council of Economic Advisors, CEA. Congress established the Council of Economic Advisors in 1946 to advise the president on economic policy based on data, research, and evidence. The CEA is one of the oldest congressionally created offices within the White House complex and plays a broad role in bringing economic expertise to administration policy across a large range of policy areas. The CEA has one presidentially appointed and Senate-confirmed chair, two presidentially appointed members who assist and often have expertise that complements the chair, and approximately 40 staff employees. Statutorily, the CEA is charged with being the president's principal source of economic advice. However, this role has diminished over time as its policy appraisal and especially formulation and recommendation functions have been taken over or diluted by other economic policy bodies within the White House. By law, the CEA is required to publish a House, creating the risk that the CEA's role in the policymaking process will be diminished. A future administration should consider hiring that reflects the White House calendar, mid-January, and involves the Office of Presidential Personnel. National Space Council, NSPC. The National Space Council is responsible for providing advice and recommendations to the President on the formulation and implementation of space policy and strategy. It is charged with conducting a whole-of-government approach to the nation's space interests, civil, military, intelligence, commercial, or diplomatic. Historically, it has been chaired by the Vice President at the President's direction, and its members consist of members of the Cabinet and other senior executive branch officials as specified by the President in Executive Order 13803. The NSPC's purpose is to ensure that the President's priorities relative to space are carried out and, as necessary, to resolve policy conflicts among departments and agencies that are related to space. Space projects and programs are risky, complex, expensive, and time-consuming, although commercial space innovations are lowering costs and accelerating schedules. Nevertheless, while fiscal discipline should not be ignored, long-term policy stability is crucial to investors, innovators, industry, and agencies. Policy stability is easier when policies and programs are aligned with long-term national interests as opposed to those of particular advocacy groups or political factions. The Trump administration's major space policies, including the U.S. Space Force, the Artemis program to land the next Americans on the moon, and support for a strong commercial space sector have endured under the Biden administration. Major challenges remain in implementation and regulatory reform to keep up with rapidly evolving space markets and competitors. These include the long-term sustainability of space activities in light of increasing orbital debris, creation of space situational awareness services for civil and commercial uses, management of megaconstellations, licensing of new commercial remote sensing capabilities, keeping up with licensing demands due to high launch rates, transitioning International Space Station operations to multiple, privately owned space platforms, and, most important, accelerating the acquisition and fielding of national security space capabilities in response to an increasingly aggressive China. The Vice President should have a clear understanding with the National SECURITY Advisor and the White House Counsel that they and their respective staffs will work within the White House to determine the scope and leadership of policy reviews that can overlap multiple areas of responsibility. A similar understanding is necessary with the heads of other policy councils such as the NEC, DPC, and National Science and Technology Council, NSTC. As a result of the President's direction and the Vice President's leadership, the NSPC under the Trump administration was able to coordinate a wide range of annual economic report of the President within 10 days after submission of the budget. This report is not just a messaging document, it is an opportunity to provide greater rigor in support of policy areas that the White House is prioritizing and to build up the external credibility of those ideas. A future conservative administration should utilize the CEA as the senior inter-NAL White House economists much as the White House counsel's office functions as the senior internal White House lawyers. This does not mean that there are no economists in other offices. There are, just as there often are lawyers in the policy councils and other White House offices, but the CEA's role, like the White House counsel's, is to employ its unique expertise, particularly on the technical side, to ensure that sound analysis is contributing to and shaping the policy discussion. In practice, this means that CEA staff do not coordinate the policy process in the way that the DPC or NEC would, but they should be integral to the EOP's policy development processes. CEA staff should support sound policy development and execution by actively contributing to running policy dialogues, proactively raising issues that need to be addressed, consulting on questions that arise, and guiding EOP and agency officials on the analytical foundations of policy. Structurally, the White House Chief of Staff should ensure that the CEA has a seat at the policy table on all relevant policies. Senior economists traditionally have not gone through the Office of Presidential Personnel process and more often than not are hired on an academic year cycle. As a result, senior economists hired in the summer of a presidential election year tend to remain on staff until the next summer even if a president from the opposite party takes power and installs a new slate of CEA political appointees for chair, members, etc. Although these hiring practices create some continuity, the presence of senior economists who were never fully vetted for their alignment with White House policy objectives or who were holdovers from a recently departed administration can breed skepticism and distrust of the CEA by other units within the White House, creating the risk that the CEA's role in the policymaking process will be diminished. A future administration should consider hiring that reflects the White House calendar, mid-January, and involves the Office of Presidential Personnel. National Space Council, NSPC. The National Space Council is responsible for providing advice and recommendations to the President on the formulation and implementation of space policy and strategy. It is charged with conducting a whole-of-government approach to the nation's space interests, civil, military, intelligence, commercial, or diplomatic. Historically, it has been chaired by the Vice President at the President's direction, and its members consist of members of the Cabinet and other senior executive branch officials as specified by the President in Executive Order 13803. The NSPC's purpose is to ensure that the President's priorities relative to space are carried out and, as necessary, to resolve policy conflicts among departments and agencies that are related to space. Space projects and programs are risky, complex, expensive, and time-consuming, although commercial space innovations are lowering costs and accelerating schedules. Nevertheless, while fiscal discipline should not be ignored, long-term policy stability is crucial to investors, innovators, industry, and agencies. Policy stability is easier when policies and programs are aligned with long-term national interests as opposed to those of particular advocacy groups or political factions. The Trump administration's major space policies, including the U.S. Space Force, the Artemis program to land the next Americans on the moon, and support for a strong commercial space sector have endured under the Biden administration. Major challenges remain in implementation and regulatory reform to keep up with rapidly evolving space markets and competitors. These include the long-term sustainability of space activities in light of increasing orbital debris, creation of space situational awareness services for civil and commercial uses, management of megaconstellations, licensing of new commercial remote sensing capabilities, keeping up with licensing demands due to high launch rates, transitioning International Space Station operations to multiple, privately owned space platforms, and, most important, accelerating the acquisition and fielding of national security space capabilities in response to an increasingly aggressive China. The Vice President should have a clear understanding with the National SECURITY Advisor and the White House Counsel that they and their respective staffs will work within the White House to determine the scope and leadership of policy reviews that can overlap multiple areas of responsibility. A similar understanding is necessary with the heads of other policy councils such as the NEC, DPC, and National Science and Technology Council, NSTC. As a result of the President's direction and the Vice President's leadership, the NSPC under the Trump administration was able to coordinate a wide range of space policy reviews, legislative proposals, and regulatory reforms smoothly. The NSPC generally led on space issues within the EOP, but other White House offices also took on space topics. As a member of the NSPC, and in coordination with other members, the Office of Science and Technology Policy developed a National Space Weather Strategy, Research and Development, R&D, plans to mitigate the effects of orbital debris, and protocols for planetary protection to avoid biological contamination of celestial bodies. The Council of Economic Advisors did research on the economic benefits of space property rights. OMB's Office of Information and Regulatory Reform updated and streamlined commercial launch licensing and commercial remote sensing satellite rules. During the Trump administration, if a topic was purely military, such as standing up the U.S. Space Command, the NSC took the lead. If a topic cut across military, civil, and commercial sectors, as was the case with cybersecurity and space, the NSPC and NSC would co-chair the policy review groups. Trusted, collegial relationships across the White House complex are critical to successful space policy development, implementation, and oversight. Nowhere is this more important than in the relationship between the NSPC staff and OMB staff who oversee civil and national security-related space spending. Teamwork between the NSPC and OMB staff can communicate clear presidential priorities to departments and agencies, facilitating smooth development of the president's budget request. The NSPC and OMB have many opportunities to collaborate in promoting presidential priorities while finding offsets in lower priority programs and funding lines. Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP. The White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, was created by the National Science and Technology Policy, Organization, and Priorities Act of 1976. Before its creation, presidents received their advice and counsel on such matters through advisors and boards that had no statutory authority. The director of OSTP is one of the few Senate-confirmed positions within the executive office of the president. Consistent with other laws, the president may delegate to the director of OSTP directive authority over other elements of the executive branch. Other EOP policy officials and organizations such as the NSC and NEC are formally only advisory with relevant agency directives issued by the president. The OSTP's functions, as contained in the law, are to advise the president of scientific and technological considerations, evaluate the effectiveness of the federal effort, and generally lead and coordinate the federal government's R&D programs. If science is being manipulated at the agencies to support separate political and institutional agendas, the president should increase the prominence of the OSTP's director either formally or informally. This would elevate the role of science in policy discussions and subsequent outcomes and theoretically help to balance out agencies like the Departments of Energy, State, and Commerce and the Environmental Protection Agency and Council on Environmental Quality. The OSTP can also help to bring technical expertise to regulatory matters in support of OMB. The OSTP should continue to play a lead role in coordinating federal R&D programs. Recent legislation, especially the CHIPS and Science Act, has expanded federal policy and funding across the enterprise, and there is a need for more significant leadership in this area both to ensure effectiveness and to avoid duplication of effort. As befitting its location in the White House, the OSTP must be concerned with advancing national interests and not merely the parochial concerns of departments, agencies, or parts of the scientific community. During the Trump and Biden administrations, there has been a bipartisan focus on prioritizing R&D funding around the so-called industries of the future, IOTF. Under President Trump, IOTF priorities were artificial intelligence, AI, quantum information science, QIS, advanced communications/5G, advanced manufacturing, and biotechnology. Under President Biden, this list has been expanded to include advanced materials, robotics, battery technology, cybersecurity, green products and clean technology, plant genetics and agricultural technologies, nanotechnology, and semiconductor and microelectronics technologies. These priorities should be evaluated and narrowed to ensure consistency with the next administration's priorities. Given a long list of priorities, coordinating efforts across agencies and assuring success are extremely challenging. The OSTP and OMB are required to work together on an annual basis to prioritize the funding requests and whatever Congress adds on top of them, but there continues to be concern about mission creep and funds expended on non-scientific R&D. The president should also issue an executive order to reshape the U.S. Global Change Research Program, USGCRP, and related climate change research programs. The USGCRP produces strategic plans and research, for example, the National Climate Assessment, that reduce the scope of legally proper options in presidential decision-making and in agency rulemakings and adjudications. Also, since much environmental policymaking must run the gauntlet of judicial review, US GCRP actions can frustrate successful litigation defense in ways that the career bureaucracy should not be permitted to control. The process for producing assessments should include diverse viewpoints. The OSTP and OMB should jointly assess the independence of the contractors used to conduct much of this outsourced government research that serves as the basis for policymaking. The next president should critically analyze and, if required, refuse to accept any US GCRP assessment prepared under the Biden administration. The president should also restore related EOP research components to their purely informational and advisory roles. Consistent with the Global Change Research Act of 1990, USCRP-related EOP components should be confined to a more limited advisory role. These components should include but not necessarily be limited to the OSTP, the NSTC's Committee on Environment, the US GCRP's interagency groups, for example, the Carbon Cycle Interagency Working Group, and the Federal Coordinating Council for Science, Engineering, and Technology. As a general matter, the new administration should separate the scientific risk assessment function from the risk management function, which is the exclusive domain of elected policymakers and the public. Finally, the next administration will face a significant challenge in unwinding policies and procedures that are used to advance radical gender, racial, and equity initiatives under the banner of science. Similarly, the Biden administration's climate fanaticism will need a whole-of-government unwinding. As with other federal departments and agencies, the Biden administration's leveraging of the federal government's resources to further the woke agenda should be reversed and scrubbed from all policy manuals, guidance documents, and agendas, and scientific excellence and innovation should be restored as the OSTP's top priority. Council on Environmental Quality, CEQ. The Council on Environmental Quality is the EOP component with the principal task of administering the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, by issuing regulations and interpretive documents and by overseeing the processes of individual permitting agencies' own NEPA regulations, including categorical exclusions. The CEQ also coordinates environmental policy across the federal government, and its influence has waxed and waned across administrations. The President should instruct the CEQ to rewrite its regulations implementing NEPA along the lines of the historic 2020 effort and restore its key provisions such as banning the use of cumulative impact analysis. This effort should incorporate new learning and more aggressive reform options that were not included in the 2020 reform package with the overall goal of streamlining the process to build on the Supreme Court ruling that CEQ's interpretation of NEPA is entitled to substantial deference. It should frame the new regulations to limit the scope for judicial review of agency NEPA analysis and judicial remedies, as well as to vindicate the strong public interest in effective and timely agency action. The Federal Permitting Improvements Steering Council, FPISC, of which the CEQ is a part, has been empowered by Congress through significant new funding and amendments to FAST 41. The President should build on this foundation to further empower the FPISC by making its executive director an EOP appointee with delegated presidential directive authority over executive branch permitting agencies. For instance, the implementation of Executive Order 13807's one federal decision revealed many ways that the systems established by EO 13807 can be improved. The new president should seek to issue a new executive order to create a unified process for major infrastructure projects that includes giving project proponents more control of any regulatory clocks. The president should issue an executive order establishing a senior advisor to coordinate the policy development and implementation of relevant energy and environment policy by officials across the EOP, for example, the policy staff of the NSC, NEC, DPC, CEQ, and OSTP, and abolishing the existing Office of Domestic CLI Policy. The senior advisor would report directly to the Chief of Staff. The role would be similar to the role that Brian Dees and John Podesta had in the Obama White House. This energy/environment coordinator would help to lead the fight for sound energy and environment policies both domestically and internationally. The President should eliminate the Interagency Working Group on the Social Cost of Carbon, SCC, which is chaired by the OSTP, OMB, and CEA, and by executive order should end the use of SCC analysis. Finally, the President should work with Congress to establish a sweeping modernization of the entire permitting system across all departments and agencies that is aimed at reducing litigation risk and giving agencies the authority to establish programmatic, general, and provisional permits. Office of National Drug Control Policy, ONDP. Congress created the Office of National Drug Control Policy, ONDCP, through the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988 to serve as a coordinating auxiliary for the President on all matters related to drug policy. The next president's top drug policy priority must be to address the current fentanyl crisis and reduce the number of overdoses and fatalities. This crisis resulted in the deaths of more than 100,000 Americans in 2021. The next administration must reaffirm a commitment to preventing drug use before it starts, providing treatment that leads to long-term recovery, and reducing the availability of illicit drugs in the United States. The drug trafficking environment is exponentially more dynamic and dangerous today than it was just 5 years ago, as powerful synthetic opioids, fentanyl and its analogs, are mixed into other drugs of abuse. Drug trafficking organizations are extremely nimble and able to adapt quickly to federal government actions and changes in user behavior. Disrupting the flow of drugs across our borders and into our communities is of paramount importance, both to save lives and to bolster our public health efforts. For these reasons, the director of ONDCP should make it a point to consult with federal border enforcement officials. The National Drug Control Program agencies represented a total of $41 billion in fiscal year 2022. Whereas the position for overseeing budget activities is traditionally held by a career official, it is imperative that a political appointee lead the ONDCP Budget Office to ensure coordination between the OMB Program Associate Director and the ONDCP Budgetary Appointee. ONDCP grant-making activities have been controversial over the years, particularly within conservative administrations concerned that the White House lacks the expertise to oversee such programs directly. The ONDCP administers 2 grant programs, the Drug-Free Communities Support Program and the High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Areas Program. While it makes sense to transfer these programs eventually to the Department of Justice and Department of Health and Human Services, respectively, it is vital that the ONDCP director ensure in the immediate term that these grant programs are funding the president's drug control priorities and not woke nonprofits with leftist policy agendas. Thus, the president must ensure that the ONDCP is managed by political appointees who are committed to the administration's agenda and not acquiesce to management by political or career military personnel who oversaw the prior administration's ONDCP. Gender Policy Council, GPC. The President should immediately revoke Executive Order 14020 and every policy, including sub-regulatory guidance documents, produced on behalf of or related to the establishment or promotion of the Gender Policy Council and its subsidiary issues. Abolishing the Gender Policy Council would eliminate central promotion of abortion, health services, comprehensive sexuality education, and the new woke gender ideology, which has as a principal tenet gender-affirming care and sex-change surgeries on minors. In addition to eliminating the council, developing new structures and positions will have the dual effect of demonstrating that promoting life and strengthening the family is a priority while also facilitating more seamless coordination and consistency across the U.S. government. Specifically, the President should appoint a position/point of contact with the rank of Special Assistant to the President or higher to coordinate and lead the President's domestic priorities on issues related to life and family in cooperation with the Domestic Policy Council. This position would be responsible for facilitating meetings, discussions, and agreements among personnel, coordinating administration policy, and ensuring agency support for implementation of policies related to the promotion of life and family in the United States. Office of the Vice President, OVP. The Vice President is elected to the second highest office in the nation and plays a constitutionally vital role as President-in-waiting. The Vice President is also the President of the Senate and is charged with breaking tie votes in that body. In recent years, the Vice President has been granted office space in the West Wing and the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. The OVP is another one of the levers that the President should use to execute his agenda. This is particularly true because there is significant and unique leverage that the Vice President's leadership of the OVP can evoke to shape policy decisions and outcomes. Every other appointed White House official serves at the pleasure of the President, whereas the Vice President is elected, and the process for filling vacancies in that Article II constitutional office, which includes confirmation of a replacement Vice President by a majority of both houses of Congress, is governed by the 25th Amendment. The Vice President has his or her own economic advisors, domestic policy and national security staff, and daily intelligence briefings. The Vice President should fill his or her office with strong and sound policy minds to effectively assist the President in fulfilling his agenda. The Vice President is also a statutory member of the National Security Council. In theory, in light of the fact that the Vice President is a member of the Smithsonian Institution's Board of Regents, there is nothing to prevent Congress from assigning the Vice President additional statutory duties. All of the component councils and offices discussed in this chapter include real policy development and implementation authority, and a robust OVP should be fully integrated into all policy formation procedures. Only a Vice President who is deeply steeped in the inner working of the interagency and policy councils can offer useful advice and prove helpful in accomplishing the President's agenda. It is also obvious, in view of the fact that many former Vice Presidents have gone on to be elected President in their own right, that the Vice Presidency can act as a training ground for presidential office. In the past, the Vice President has been tasked with leading certain initiatives or issues. For example, Mike Pence was tasked with coordinating the federal response to COVID-19, and both Pence and Kamala Harris have chaired the National Space Council. Vice Presidents Richard Cheney and Dan Quayle were also active on the deregulatory front and in imposing regulatory moratoria. However, OVP-OFFICIL should be fully integrated into each and every process from the start of a new administration and not have to wait to be invited to join various meetings or working groups on an ad hoc basis. For example, the budget and regulatory review processes are linchpins in the execution of policy, and the OVP should have a seat at the table through every phase of policy development. Past vice presidents have also spent significant time abroad serving as a type of brand ambassador for the White House and, more broadly, for the United States, announcing administration priorities and coordinating with heads of state and other top officials of foreign governments. The vice president, as president of the Senate, often serves as a presidential emissary to the Senate and thus can be especially helpful in securing passage of the president's legislative agenda. To the extent that he or she desires, a vice president can have a direct role in shaping administration policy. A vice president who regularly attends meetings and disperses staff across the interagency and policy councils is a vice president whose voice will be heard. Title IV, Central Personnel Agencies, Managing the Bureaucracy. From the very first mandate for leadership, the personnel as policy theme has been the fundamental principle guiding the government's personnel management. As the U.S. The Constitution makes clear, the president's appointment, direction, and removal authorities are the central elements of his executive power. In implementing that power, the people and the president deserve the most talented and responsible workforce possible. Who the president assigns to design and implement his political policy agenda will determine whether he can carry out the responsibility given to him by the American people. The president must recognize that whoever holds a government position sets its policy. To fulfill an electoral mandate, he must therefore give personnel management his highest priority, including cabinet-level precedence. The federal government's immense bureaucracy spreads into hundreds of agencies and thousands of units and is centered and overseen at the top by key central personnel agencies and their governing laws and regulations. The major separate personnel agencies in the national government today are the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, the Merit Systems Protection Board, MSPB, the Federal Labor Relations Authority, FLRA, and the Office of Special Counsel, OSC. Title V of the U.S. Code charges the OPM with executing, administering, and enforcing the rules, regulations, and laws governing the civil service. It grants the OPM direct responsibility for activities like retirement, pay, health, training, federal unionization, suitability, and classification functions not specifically granted to other agencies by statute. The agency's director is charged with aiding the president, as the president may request, in preparing such civil service rules as the president prescribes and otherwise advising the president on actions that may be taken to promote an efficient civil service and a systematic application of the merit system principles, including recommending policies relating to the selection, promotion, transfer, performance, pay, conditions of service, tenure, and separation of employees. The MSPB is the lead adjudicator for hearing and resolving cases and controversies for 2.2 million federal employees. It is required to conduct fair and neutral case adjudications, regulatory reviews, and actions and studies to improve the workforce. Its court-like adjudications investigate and hear appeals from agency actions such as furloughs, suspensions, demotions, and terminations and are appealable to the U.S. Court of Appeals. The FLRA hears appeals of agency personnel cases involving federal labor grievance procedures to provide judicial review with binding decisions appealable to appeals courts. It interprets the rights and duties of agencies and employee labor organizations on management rights, OPM interpretations, recognition of labor organizations, and unfair labor practices under the general principle of bargain in good faith and compelling need. The OSC serves as the investigator, mediator, publisher, and prosecutor before the MSPB with respect to agency and employees regarding prohibited personnel practices, Hatch Act politicization, Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act issues, and whistleblower complaints. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, has general responsibility for reviewing charges of employee discrimination against all civil rights breaches. However, it also administers a government employees section that investigates and adjudicates federal employee complaints concerning equal employment violations as with the private sector. This makes the agency an additional de facto factor in government personnel management. While not a personnel agency per se, the General Services Administration, GSA, is charged with general supervision of contracting. Today, there are many more contractors in government than there are civil service employees. The GSA must therefore be a part of any personnel management discussion. Analysis and recommendations. OPM, managing the federal bureaucracy. At the very pinnacle of the modern progressive program to make government competence stands the ideal of professionalized, career civil service. Since the turn of the 20th century, progressives have sought a system that could effectively select, train, reward, and guard from partisan influence the neutral scientific experts they believe are required to staff the national government and run the administrative state. Their U.S. system was initiated by the Pendleton Act of 1883 and institutionalized by the 1930s New Deal to set principles and practices that were meant to ensure that expert merit rather than partisan favors or personal favoritism ruled within the federal bureaucracy. Yet, as public frustration with the civil service has grown, generating calls to drain the swamp, it has become clear that their project has had serious unintended consequences. The civil service was devised to replace the amateurism and presumed corrupt tie-in of the old spoils system, wherein government jobs awarded loyal partisans who might or might not have professional backgrounds. Although the system appeared to be sufficient for the nation's first century, progressive intellectuals and activists demanded a more professionalized, scientific, and politically neutral administration. Progressives designed a merit system to promote expertise and shield bureaucrats from partisan political pressure, but it soon began to insulate civil servants from accountability. The modern merit system increasingly made it almost impossible to fire all but the most incompetent civil servants. Complying with arcane rules regarding recruiting, rating, hiring, and firing simply replaced the goal of cultivating competence and expertise. In the 1970s, Georgia Democratic Governor Jimmy Carter, then a political unknown, ran for president supporting New Deal programs and their Great Society expansion but opposing the way they were being administered. The policies were not actually reducing poverty, increasing prosperity, or improving the environment, he argued, and to make them work required fundamental bureaucratic reform. He correctly charged that almost all government employees were rated as successful, all received the same pay regardless of performance, and even the worst were impossible to fire, and he won the presidency. President Carter fulfilled his campaign promise by hiring Syracuse University Dean Alan Campbell, who served first as chairman of the U.S. Civil Service Commission and then as director of the OPM and helped him devise and pass the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, CSRA, to reset the basic structure of today's bureaucracy. A new performance appraisal system was devised with a 5 rather than 3 distribution of rating categories and individual goals more related to agency missions and more related to employee promotion for all. Pay and benefits were based directly on improved performance appraisals, including sizable bonuses for mid-level managers and senior executives. But time ran out on President Carter before the act could be fully executed, so it was left to President Ronald Reagan and his new OPM and agency leadership to implement. Overall, the new law seemed to work for a few years under Reagan, but the Carter-Reagan reforms were dissipated within a decade. Today, employee evaluation is back to pre-reform levels with almost all rated successful or above, frustrating any relative between pay and performance. An outstanding rating should be required for senior executive service (SES) chiefs to win big bonuses, but a few years ago, when it was disclosed that the Veterans Administration executives who encouraged false reporting of waiting lists for hospital admission were rated outstanding, the Senior Executive Association justified it, telling Congress that only outstanding performers would be promoted to the SES in the first place and that precise ratings were unnecessary. The Government Accountability Office, GAO, however, has reported that pay raises, within-grade pay increases, and locality pay for regular employees and executives have become automatic rather than based on performance as a result of most employees being rated at similar appraisal levels. OPM, merit hiring in a merit system. It should not be impossible even for a large national government to hire good people through merit selection. The government did so for years, but it has proven difficult in recent times to select personnel based on their knowledge, skills, and abilities, KSA, as the law dictates. Yet for the past 34 years, the U.S. Civil Service has been unable to distinguish consistently between strong and unqualified applicants for employment. As the Carter presidency was winding down, the U.S. Department of Justice and top lawyers at the OPM contrived with plaintiffs to end civil service IQ examinations because of concern about their possible impact on minorities. The OPM had used the Professional and Administrative Career Examination, PACE, General Intelligence Exam to select college graduates for top agency employment, but Carter administration officials, probably without the president's informed concurrence, abolished the PACE through a legal consent court decree capitulating to demands by civil rights petitioners who contended that it was discriminatory. The judicial decree was to last only 5 years but still controls federal hiring and is applied to all KSA tests even today. General ability tests like the PACE have been used successfully to assess the usefulness and cost-effectiveness of broad intellectual qualities across many separate occupations. Courts have ruled that even without evidence of overt, intentional discrimination, such results might suggest discrimination. This doctrine of disparate impact could be ended legislatively or at least narrowed through the regulatory process by a future administration. In any event, the federal government has been denied the use of a rigorous entry examination for 3 decades, relying instead on self-evaluations that have forced managers to resort to subterfuge such as pre-selecting friends or associates that they believe are competent to obtain qualified employees. In 2015, President Barack Obama's OPM began to introduce an improved merit examination called USA Hire, which it had been testing quietly since 2012 in a few agencies for a dozen job descriptions. The tests had multiple-choice questions with only one correct answer. Some questions even required essay replies, questions that would change regularly to depress cheating. President Donald Trump's OPM planned to implement such changes but was delayed because of legal concerns over possible disparate impact. Courts have agreed to review the consent decree if the uniform guidelines on employee selection procedures setting the technical requirements for sound exams are reformed. A government that is unable to select employees based on KSA-like test qualifications cannot work, and the OPM must move forward on this very basic personnel management obligation. The centrality of performance appraisal. In the meantime, the OPM must manage the workforce it has. Before they can reward or discipline federal employees, managers must first identify who their top performers are and who is performing less than adequately. In fact, as Ludwig von Mises proved in his classic Bureaucracy, unlike the profit and loss evaluation tool used in the private sector, government performance measurement depends totally on a functioning appraisal system. If they cannot be identified in the first place within a functioning appraisal system, it is impossible to reward good performance or correct poor performance. The problem is that the collegial atmosphere of a bureaucracy in a multifaceted appraisal system that is open to appeals makes this a very challenging ideal to implement successfully. The GAO reported more recently that overly high and widely spread performance ratings were again plaguing the government, with more than 99% of employees rated fully successful or above by their managers, a mere 0.3% rated as minimally successful, and 0.1% actually rated unacceptable. Why? It is human nature that no one appreciates being told that he or she is less than outstanding in every way. Informing subordinates in a closely knit bureaucracy that they are not performing well is difficult. Rating compatriots is even considered rude and unprofessional. Moreover, managers can be and often are accused of racial or sexual discrimination for a poor rating, and this discourages honesty. In 2018, President Trump issued Executive Order 13839 requiring agencies to reduce the time for employees to improve performance before corrective action could be taken, to initiate disciplinary actions against poorly performing employees more expeditiously, to reiterate that agencies are obligated to make employees improve, to reduce the time for employees to respond to allegations of poor performance, to mandate that agencies remind supervisors of expiring employee probationary periods, to prohibit agencies from entering into settlement agreements that modify an employee's personnel record, and to re-evaluate posters for agencies to discipline supervisors who retaliate against whistleblowers. Unfortunately, the order was overturned by the Biden administration, so it will need to be reintroduced in 2025. The fact remains that meaningfully evaluating employees' performance is a critical part of a manager's job. In the Reagan appraisal process, managers were evaluated on how they themselves rated their subordinates. This is critical to responsibility and improved management. It is essential that political executives build policy goals directly into employee appraisals both for mission success and for employees to know what is expected. Indistinguishable from their coworkers on paper, hardworking federal employees often go unrewarded for their efforts and are often the system's greatest critics. Federal workers who are performing inadequately get neither the benefit of an honest appraisal nor clear guidance on how to improve. Political executives should take an active role in supervising performance appraisals of career staff, not unduly delegate this responsibility to senior career managers, and be willing to reward and support good performers. Merit pay. Performance appraisal means little to daily operations if it is not tied directly to real consequences for success as well as failure. According to a survey of major U.S. private companies, which, unlike the federal government, also have a profit and loss evaluation, 90% use a system of merit pay for performance based on some type of appraisal system. Despite early efforts to institute merit pay throughout the federal government, however, compensation is still based primarily on seniority rather than merit. Merit pay for executives and managers was part of the Carter reforms and was implemented early in the Reagan presidency. Beginning in the summer of 1982, the Reagan OPM entered 18 months of negotiations with House and Senate staff on extending merit pay to the entire workforce. Long and detailed talks between the OPM and both Democrats and Republicans in Congress ensued, and a final agreement was reached in 1983 that supposedly ensured the passage of legislation creating a new performance management and recognition system, PMRS, for all, not just management, GS-13 through GS-15 employees. Meanwhile, the OPM issued regulations to expand the role of performance-related to pay throughout the entire workforce, but congressional allies of the employee unions, led by Representative Steny Hoyer, D., of Government Employee, Rich, Maryland, stoutly resisted this extension of pay for performance and, with strong union support, used the congressional appropriations process to block OPM administrative pay reforms. Bonuses for SES career employees survived, but performance appraisals became so high and widely distributed that there was little relationship between performance and remuneration. Ever since the original merit pay system for federal managers, GM 13 through GM 15 grade levels, just below the SES, was allowed to expire in September 1993, little to nothing has been done either to reinstate the federal merit pay program for managers or to distribute performance rating evaluations for the SES, much less to extend the program to the remainder of the workforce. A reform-friendly president in Congress might just provide the opportunity to create a more comprehensive performance plan. In the meantime, however, political executives should use exist-ing pay and especially fiscal awards strategically to reward good performance to the degree allowed by law. Making the appeals process work. The non-military government dismissal rate is well below 1%, and no private sector industry employee enjoys the job security that a federal employee enjoys. Both safety and justice demand that managers learn to act strategically to hire good and fire poor performers legally. The initial paperwork required to separate poor or abusive performers, when they are infrequently identified, is not overwhelming, and managers might be motivated to act if it were not for the appeals and enforcement processes. Formal appeal in the private sector is mostly a rather simple two-step process, but government unions and associations have been able to convince politicians to support a multiple and extensive appeals and enforcement process. As noted, there are multiple administrative appeals bodies. The FLRA, OSC, and EEOC have relatively narrow jurisdictions. Claims that an employee's removal or disciplinary actions violate the terms of a collective bargaining agreement between an agency and a union are handled by the FLRA. Employees who claim their removal was the result of discrimination can appeal to the EEOC, and employees who believe their firing was retribution for being a whistleblower can go to the OSC. While the MSPB specializes in abuses of direct merit system issues, it can and does hear and review almost any of the matters heard by the other agencies. Cases involving race, gender, religion, age, pregnancy, disability, or national origin can be appealed to the EEOC or the MSPB, and in some cases to both and to the OSC. This gives employees multiple opportunities to prove their cases, and while the EEOC, MSPB, FLRA, and OSC may all apply essentially the same burden of proof, the odds of success may be substantially different in each forum. In fact, forum shopping among them for a friendlier venue is a common practice, but frequent filers face no consequences for frivolous complaints. As a result, meritorious cases are frequently delayed, denying relief and justice to truly aggrieved individuals. The MSPB can and does handle all such matters, but it faces a backlog of an estimated 3,000 cases of people who were potentially wrongfully terminated or disciplined as far back as 2013. From 2017 to 2022, the MSPB lacked the quorum required to decide appeals. On the other hand, as of January 2023, the EEOC had a backlog of 42,000 cases. While federal employees win appeals relatively infrequently, MSPB administrative judges have upheld agency decisions as much as 80% of the time. The real problem is the time and paperwork involved in the elaborate process that managers must undergo during appeals. This keeps even the best managers from bringing cases in all but the most egregious cases of poor performance or misconduct. As a result, the MSPB, EEOC, FLRA, and OSC likely see very few cases compared to the number of occurrences, and non-performers continue to be paid and often are placed in non-work positions. Having a choice of appeals is especially unique to the government. If lower priority issues were addressed in-house, serious adverse actions would be less subject to delay. With the proper limitation of labor union actions, the FLRA should have limited reason for appeals. The EEOC's federal employees section should be transferred to the MSPB, and many of the OCS's investigatory functions should be returned to the OPM. The MSPB could then become the main reviewer of adverse actions, greatly simplifying the burdensome appeal process. Making civil service benefits economically and administratively ratio-NAL. In recent years, the combined wages and benefits of the executive branch civilian workforce totaled $300 billion according to official data. But even that amount does not properly account for billions in unfunded liability for retirement and other government reporting distortions. Official data also report employment as approximately 2 million, but this ignores approximately 20 million contractors who, while not eligible for government pay and benefits, do receive them indirectly through contracting, even if they are less generous. Official data also claim that national government employees are paid less than private sector employees are paid for similar work, but several more neutral sources demonstrate that public sector workers make more on average than their private sector counterparts. All of this extravagance deserves close scrutiny. Market-based pay and benefits. According to current law, federal workers are to be paid wages comparable to equivalent private sector workers rather than compared to all private sector employees. While the official studies claim that federal employees are underpaid relative to the private sector by 20% or more, a 2016 Heritage Foundation study found that federal employees received wages that were 22% higher than wages for similar private sector workers. If the value of employee benefits was included, the total compensation premium for federal employees over their private sector equivalents increased to between 30% and 40%. The American Enterprise Institute found a 14% pay premium and a 61% total compensation premium. Base salary is only one component of a federal employee's total compensation. In addition to high starting wages, federal employees normally receive an annual cost of living adjustment, available to all employees, and generous scheduled raises known as step increases. Moreover, a large proportion of federal employees are stationed in the Washington, D.C. area and other large cities and are entitled to steep locality pay enhancement to account for the high cost of living in these areas. A federal employee with 5 years' experience receives 20 vacation days, 13 paid sick days, and all 10 federal holidays compared to an employee at a large private company who receives 13 days of vacation and 8 paid sick days. Federal health benefits are more comparable to those provided by Fortune 500 employers, with the government paying 72% of the weighted average premiums, but this is much higher than for most private plans. Almost half of private firms do not offer any employer contributions at all. The obvious solution to these discrepancies is to move closer to a market model for federal pay and benefits. One need is for a neutral agency to oversee pay hiring decisions, especially for high-demand occupations. The OPM is independent of agency operations, so it can assess requirements. Career civil servants enjoy retirement benefits that are nearly unheard of in the private sector. Federal employees retire earlier, normally at age 55 after 30 years, enjoy richer pension annuities, and receive automatic cost of living adjustments based on the areas in which they retire. Defined benefit federal pensions are fully indexed for inflation, a practice that is extremely rare in the private sector. A federal employee with a pre-retirement income of $25,000 under the older of the two federal retirement plans will receive at least $200,000 more over a 20-year period than will private sector workers with the same pre-retirement salary under historic inflation levels. During the early Reagan years, the OPM reformed many specific provisions of the federal pension program to save billions administratively. Under OPM pressure, Reagan and Congress ultimately ended the old Civil Service Retirement System, CSRS, entirely for new employees, which, counting disbursements for the unfunded liability, accounted for 51.3% of the federal government's total payroll. The retirement system that replaced it, the Federal Employees Retirement System, FERS, reduced the cost of federal employee retirement disbursements to 28.5% of payroll, including contributions to Social Security and the employer match to the Thrift Savings Plan. Most of the pension cost was shifted to the employee, but the new system was much more equitable for the 40% who received few or no benefits under the old system. By 1999, more than half of the federal workforce was covered by the new system, and the government's per capita share of the cost, as the employer, was less than half the cost of the old system, 20.2% of FERS payroll versus 44.3% of CSRS payroll, representing one of the largest examples of government savings anywhere. Although the government pension system has become more like private pension systems, it still remains much more generous, and other means might be considered in the future to move it even closer to private plans. GSA, Landlord and Contractor Management. The General Services Administration is best known as the federal government's landlord, designing, constructing, managing, and preserving government buildings and leasing and managing outside commercial real estate contracting with 376.9 million square feet of space. Obviously, as its prime function, real estate expertise is key to the GSA's success. However, the GSA is also the government's purchasing agent, connecting federal purchasers with commercial products and services in the private sector and their personnel management functions. With contractors performing so many functions today, the GSA therefore becomes a de facto part of government-wide personnel management. The GSA also manages the Presidential Transition Act, PTA, process, which also directly involves the OPM. A recent proposal would have incorporated the OPM in GSA and OMB. Fortunately, this did not take place in that form, but it would make sense for GSA and OPM leadership and staff to hold regular meetings to work through matters of common interest such as moderating PTA personnel restrictions and the relationships between contract and civil service employees. Reductions in force. Reducing the number of federal employees seems an obvious way to reduce the overall expense of the civil service, and many prior administrations have attempted to do just this. Presidents Bill Clinton and Barack Obama began their terms, as did Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump, by mandating a freeze on the hiring of new federal employees, but these efforts did not lead to permanent and substantial reductions in the number of non-defense federal employees. First, it is a challenge even to know which workers to cut. As mentioned, there are 2 million federal employees, but since budgets have exploded, so has the total number of personnel with nearly 10 times more federal contractors than federal employees. Contractors are less expensive because they are not entitled to high government pensions or benefits and are easier to fire and discipline. In addition, millions of state government employees work under federal grants, in effect administering federal programs. These cannot be cut directly. Cutting federal employment can be helpful and can provide a simple story to average citizens, but cutting functions, levels, funds, and grants is much more important than setting simple employment size. Simply reducing numbers can actually increase costs. OMB instructions following President Trump's employment freeze told agencies to consider buyout programs, encouraging early retirements in order to shift costs from current budgets and agencies to the retirement system and minimize the number of personnel fired. The Environmental Protection Agency immediately implemented such a program, and OMB urged the passage of legislation to increase payout maximums from $25,000 to $40,000 to further increase spending under the cuts. President Clinton's OMB had introduced a similar buyout that cost the Treasury $2.8 billion, mostly for those who were going to retire anyway. Moreover, when a new employee is hired to fill a job recently vacated in a buyout, the government for a time is paying 2 people to fill 1 job. What is needed at the beginning is a freeze on all top career position hiring to prevent burrowing in by outgoing political appointees. Moreover, for FAC tours determine the order in which employees are protected during layoffs, tenure, veterans' preference, seniority, and performance in that order of importance. Despite several attempts in the House of Representatives during the Trump years to enact legislation that would modestly increase the weight given to performance over time of service, the fierce opposition by federal managers' associations and unions representing long-serving but not necessarily well-performing constituents explains why the bills failed to advance. A determined president should insist that performance be first and be wary of costly types of reductions in force. Impenetrable bureaucracy. The GAO has identified almost 100 actions that the executive branch or Congress could take to improve efficiency and effectiveness across 37 areas that span a broad range of government missions and functions. It identified 33 actions to address mission fragmentation, overlap, and duplication in the 12 areas of defense, economic development, health, homeland security, and information technology. It also identified 59 other opportunities for executive agencies or Congress to reduce the cost of government operations or enhance revenue collection across 25 areas of government. A logical place to begin would be to identify and eliminate functions and programs that are duplicated across cabinet departments or spread across multiple agencies. Congress hoped to help this effort by passing the Government Performance and Results Act of 1993, which required all federal agencies to define their missions, establish goals and objectives, and measure and report their performance to Congress. 3 decades of endless time-consuming reports later, the government continues to grow but with more paper and little change either in performance or in the number of levels between government and the people. The Brookings Institution's Paul Light emphasizes the importance of the increasing number of levels between the top heads of departments and the people at the bottom who receive the products of government decision-making. He estimates that there are perhaps 50 or more levels of impenetrable bureaucracy and no way other than imperfect performance appraisals to communicate between them. The Trump administration proposed some possible consolidations, but these were not received favorably in Congress, whose approval is necessary for most such proposals. The best solution is to cut functions and budgets and devolve responsibilities. That is a challenge primarily for presidents, Congress, and the entire government, but the OPM still needs to lead the way government-wide in managing personnel properly even in any future smaller government. Creating a responsible career management service. The people elect a president who is charged by Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution with seeing that the laws are faithfully executed with his political appointees democratically linked to that legitimizing responsibility. An autonomous bureaucracy has neither independent constitutional status nor separate moral legitimacy. Therefore, career civil servants by themselves should not lead major policy changes and reforms. The creation of the Senior Executive Service was the top career change introduced by the 1978 Carter-Campbell Civil Service Reform Act. Its aim was to professionalize the career service and make it more responsible to the democratically elected commander-in-chief and his political appointees while respecting the rights due to career employees, very much including those in the top positions. The new SES would allow management to be more flexible in filling and reassigning executive positions and locations beyond narrow specialties for more efficient mission accomplishment and would provide pay and large bonuses to motivate career performance. The desire to infiltrate political appointees improperly into the high career civil service has been widespread in every administration, whether Democrat or Republican. Democratic administrations, however, are typically more successful because they require the cooperation of careerists, who generally lean heavily to the left. Such burrowing in requires career job descriptions for new positions that closely mirror the functions of a political appointee, a special hiring authority that allows the bypassing of veterans' preference as well as other preference categories, and the ability to frustrate career candidates from taking the desired position. President Reagan's OPM began by limiting such SES burrowing in, arguing that the proper course was to create and fill political positions. This simultaneously promotes the CSRA principle of political leadership of the bureaucracy and respects the professional autonomy of the career service. But this requires that career SES employees should respect political rights too. Actions such as career staff reserving excessive numbers of key policy positions as career reserved to deny them to non-career SES employees frustrate CSRA intent. Another evasion is the general domination by career staff on SES personnel evaluation boards, the opposite of non-career executives dominating these critical meeting discussions as expected in the SES. Career training also often underplays the political role in leadership and inculcates career-first policy and value viewpoints. Frustrated with these activities by top career executives, the Trump administration issued Executive Order 13957 to make career professionals in positions that are not normally subject to change as a result of a presidential transition but who discharge significant duties and exercise significant discretion in formulating and implementing executive branch policy and programs an exception to the competitive hiring rules and examinations for career positions under a new Schedule F. It ordered the director of OPM and agency heads to set procedures to prepare lists of such confidential, policy determining, policymaking, or policy advocating positions and prepare procedures to create exceptions from civil service rules when careerists hold such positions, from which they can relocate back to the regular civil service after such service. The order was subsequently reversed by President Biden at the demand of the civil service associations and unions. It should be reinstated, but SES responsibility should come first. Managing personnel in a union environment. Historically, unions were thought to be incompatible with government management. There is a natural limit to the bargaining power of private sector unions, but the financial bottom line of public sector unions is not similarly constrained. If private sector unions push too hard a bargain, they can so harm a company or so reduce efficiency that their employer is forced to go out of business and eliminate union jobs altogether. There is no such limit in government, which cannot go out of business, so demands can be excessive without negatively affecting employee and union bottom lines. Even Democratic President Franklin Roosevelt considered union representation in the federal government to be incompatible with democracy. Striking and even threats of bargaining and delay were considered acts against the people and thus improper. It was not until President John Kennedy that union representation in the federal government was recognized, and then merely by executive order. Labor bargaining was not set in statute until the Carter administration was forced by Congress to do so in order to pass the CSRA, although all bargaining was placed under OPM review. The CSRA was able to maintain strong management rights for the OPM and agencies and forbade collective bargaining on pay and benefits as well as management prerogatives. Over time, OPM, FLRA, and agencies' personnel offices and courts, especially in Democratic administrations, narrowed management rights so that labor bargaining expanded as management rights contracted. But the management rights are still in statute, have been enforced by some administrations, and should be enforced again by any future OPM and agency managements, which should not be intimidated by union power. Rather than being daunted, President Trump issued 3 executive orders, Executive Order 13836, encouraging agencies to renegotiate all union collective bargaining agreements to ensure consistency with the law and respect for management rights, Executive Order 13837, encouraging agencies to prevent union representatives from using official time preparing or pursuing grievances or from engaging in other union activity on government time, and Executive Order 13839, encouraging agencies both to limit labor grievances on removals from service or on challenging performance appraisals and to prioritize performance over seniority when deciding who should be retained following reductions in force. All were revoked by the Biden administration and should be reinstated by the next administration, to include the immediate appointment of the FLRA General Counsel and reactivation of the impasses panel. Congress should also consider whether public sector unions are appropriate in the first place. The bipartisan consensus up until the middle of the 20th century held that these unions were not compatible with constitutional government. After more than half a century of experience with public sector union frustrations of good government management, it is hard to avoid reaching the same conclusion. Fully staffing the ranks of political appointees. The president must rely legally on his top department and agency officials to run the government, and on top, President Trump faced special hostility from the opposition party and the media in getting his appointees confirmed or even considered by the Senate. His early Office of Presidential Personnel, PPO, did not generally remove political appointees from the previous administration but instead relied mostly on prior political appointees and career civil servants to run the government. Such a reliance on holdovers and bureaucrats led to a lack of agency control and the absolute refusal of the acting Attorney General from the Obama administration to obey a direct order from the president. Under the early PPO, the Trump administration appointed fewer political appointees in its first few months in office than had been appointed in any recent presidency, partly because of historically high partisan congressional obstructions but also because several officials announced that they preferred fewer political appointees in the agencies as a way to cut federal spending. Whatever the reasoning, this had the effect of permanently hampering the rollout of the new president's agenda. Thus, in those critical early years, much of the government relied on senior careerists and holdover Obama appointees to carry out the sensitive responsibilities that would otherwise belong to the new president's appointees. Fortunately, the later PPO, OPM, and Senate leadership began to cooperate to build a strong team to implement the president's personnel appointment agenda. Any new administration would be wise to learn that it will need a full cadre of sound political appointees from the beginning if it expects to direct this enormous federal bureaucracy. A close relationship between the PPO at the White House and the OPM, coordinating with agency assistant secretaries of administration and PPO's chosen White House liaisons and their staff at each agency, is essential to the management of this large, multilevel, resistant, and bureaucratic challenge. If personnel as policy is to be our general guide, it would make sense to give the president direct supervision of the bureaucracy with the OPM director available in his cabinet. A reformed bureaucracy. Today, the federal government's bureaucracy cannot even meet its own civil service ideals. The merit criteria of ability, knowledge, and skills are no longer the basis for recruitment, selection, or advancement, while pay and benefits for comparable work are substantially above those in the private sector. Retention is not based primarily on performance, and for the most part, inadequate performance is not appraised, corrected, or punished. The authors have made many suggestions here that, if implemented, could bring that bureaucracy more under control and enable it to work more efficiently and responsibly, which is especially required for the half of the civilian government that administers its undeniable responsibilities for defense and foreign affairs. While a better administered central bureaucracy is crucial for both those and domestic responsibilities, the problem of properly running the government goes beyond simple bureaucratic administration. The specific deficiencies of the federal bureaucracy, size, levels of organization, inefficiency, expense, and lack of responsiveness to political leadership are rooted in the progressive ideology that unelected experts can and should be trusted to promote the general welfare in just about every area of social life. The Constitution, however, reserved a few enumerated powers to the federal government while leaving the great majority of domestic activities to state, local, and private governance. As James Madison explained, the powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects, which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. Modern progressive politics has simply given the national government more to do than the complex separation of powers Constitution allows. That progressive system has broken down in our time, and the only real solution is for the national government to do less, to decentralize and privatize as much as possible and then ensure that the remaining bureaucracy is managed effectively along the lines of the enduring principles set out in detail here.